Hello, I'm Arthur Reed. Welcome to the World War II History Channel, where we explore the pivotal moments and untold stories of the greatest generation. The snow fell not as a storm, but as a quiet blanket, gently burying the weary world beneath it. If you were to stand in that ancient, towering forest on that deep winter night, you would not believe you were standing at the edge of the world's greatest conflict. The towering pines, ancient and stoic, stood like silent guardians over the frozen earth. Their heavy branches drooped low, catching the delicate, crystalline flakes that drifted down from a moonlit, slate-gray sky. The wind had died away, leaving behind a stillness so profound, so absolute, that the men huddled beneath the roots and in the earthen dugouts could hear the gentle, rhythmic sound of their own breathing. In this quiet corner of the frontier, a deceptive peace had settled over the lines. For days, the distant, thunderous voices of the great guns had been silent. The relentless, mechanical roar that usually tore the sky apart had faded into a memory, replaced by the soft rustle of settling snow and the occasional, sharp snap of a freezing branch echoing through the timber. For the German soldiers holding these quiet, snow-draped woods, the silence was a heavy, intoxicating medicine. It was an illusion, perhaps, but it was an illusion they desperately needed to believe in. Deep in a shallow, timber-lined dugout, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, sweet pine sap, and the faint, earthy aroma of a small, carefully guarded fire. Young men, barely out of their school days, sat shoulder to shoulder, pulling their meager body heat against the creeping frost. Among them was a soldier named Elias. He was not a hardened warrior of iron and steel. He was a baker's son from a quiet village, a boy who knew the soft warmth of rising dough far better than the cold steel of the rifle resting against his knee. Elias slowly rubbed his hands together, his breath pluming in the dim, flickering light of a single, stubby candle. He wore a pair of thick, gray woolen gloves, frayed at the fingertips. They had been knitted by his older sister, sent in a parcel weeks ago when the autumn leaves first began to fall. Now, in the deep freeze of winter, those simple stitches were his most treasured possession. He ran his thumb over the uneven yarn, finding a strange, profound comfort in the imperfection of the knitting. It was a tangible piece of home, a quiet reminder that somewhere, far beyond this frozen forest, there was a world of warmth, of safety, of people who loved him. Beside him, an older soldier named Thomas slept with his chin resting on his chest. Thomas was the quiet father figure of their small group, a man whose gentle smile and calm demeanor had carried the younger boys through the darkest, rain-soaked nights of the autumn retreat. Now, his face was relaxed, the deep lines of worry around his eyes softened by the dim light and the heavy veil of exhaustion. He muttered something softly in his sleep, a woman's name, spoken with such tender longing that Elias felt a lump rise in his own throat. This was the quiet reality of the line. Strip away the uniforms, the grand strategies, and the moving lines on a general's map, and what remained were simply ordinary men, sitting in the cold dirt, dreaming of ordinary lives. They did not speak of empires or conquests in the dark. They spoke of the smell of rain on cobblestone streets, the taste of a proper cup of coffee, the feeling of a clean, linen bedsheet. The silence outside stretched on, thick and unbroken. The longer it lasted, the more the men allowed themselves to relax. The heavy knot of constant, paralyzing anxiety in their stomachs began to slowly, ever so gently, untie itself. They convinced themselves that the enemy across the valley, invisible and silent in the white expanse, was just as cold, just as tired, and just as eager to simply sit out the winter. The war, it seemed, had gone to sleep under the frost. In another dugout just down the line, a faint, metallic clinking broke the silence. Two friends, Matthias and Lucas, were sharing the last of a stale loaf of bread and a tin cup of hot water steeped with roasted acorns, a bitter, dark brew they pretended was coffee. They passed the dented tin cup back and forth, their hands brushing, a silent acknowledgement of their shared endurance. "Do you think they've stopped for the season?" Matthias whispered, his voice barely carrying over the crackle of their tiny, hidden stove. Lucas took a slow sip, letting the warm liquid soothe his throat. He looked out through the narrow opening of the dugout, out into the beautiful, treacherous white forest. "It's too cold to move," he murmured softly. "Even the machines are frozen." "Yes. I think it's over. Just for a little while. I think we can rest." That word, rest, hung in the cold air like a beautiful, fragile ornament. It was a dangerous word to believe in, but in the quiet of the night, with the snow falling so peacefully, it was impossible to resist. The tension bled out of their shoulders. Sentries standing watch at the edge of the tree line leaned heavily against the frosted bark of the pines, their eyelids heavy, lulled by the mesmerizing, rhythmic fall of the snowflakes. The forest was holding its breath, and the men breathed out. It is in these incredibly quiet moments that the human heart seeks out the things that tether it to the past. Men reached into their tunics, withdrawing worn, folded letters, reading words they had already memorized just to see the handwriting of a mother, a wife, a sweetheart. They held small, faded photographs to the candlelight, tracing the faces of their children with frostbitten fingers. These small, physical objects were anchors in a world that felt entirely unmoored. They were proof that a gentle world still existed. And it is this deep, human desire to hold on to history, to touch the tangible remnants of the past, that still moves us today. When we look back at these quiet moments of the war, we often seek ways to connect with those stories, to see what they saw, and to remember the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of such vast historical tides. If you are someone who finds comfort and meaning in preserving these stories, or if you simply love immersing yourself in the profound history of this era, there are beautiful ways to do so. Many history enthusiasts find a deep sense of connection by collecting authentic WWII memorabilia, holding a piece of history in their own hands, or by watching masterfully crafted films that capture the breathtaking scale and deeply personal sacrifices of the war, such as the movie Midway, which you can find on Amazon Prime. Exploring the Pacific Theater offers a profound contrast and parallel to the frozen forests of Europe, reminding us of the global, shared experience of these young men. I've found some truly wonderful resources and collections on Amazon for those who want to build their own connection to the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my way of making sure you can safely explore the history we share together. Returning to the quiet forest, the night deepened, pulling the velvet darkness closer around the huddled men. The temperature continued to drop, freezing the mud of the trenches into solid, unforgiving ridges. Yet, even in the biting cold, a strange sense of comfort pervaded the line. The fear of sudden violence, which had been their constant, suffocating companion for months, had seemingly evaporated into the winter mist. Elias folded his arms across his chest, leaning his head back against the earthen wall of the dugout. He closed his eyes, and the sound of the forest faded away, replaced by the memory of his village. He could almost hear the church bells ringing through the valley on a Sunday morning. He could almost smell the sweet, yeasty aroma of the bakery, the warmth of the great stone ovens radiating against his skin. It was a memory so vivid, so real, that a small, peaceful smile touched his lips. Up on the line, the sentries stood like statues of snow. Their breaths came in slow, rhythmic clouds. The vast expanse of no man's land was a beautiful, undisturbed sea of white, glittering under the faint light of the stars that had begun to peek through the breaking clouds. There was no movement. There was no sound. There was only the earth, resting under its icy blanket. They did not know that miles away, beneath the same cold stars, steel was being loaded into breeches. They did not know that coordinates were being whispered in the dark, that the great, mechanical beast of the opposing army was not sleeping, but merely holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They only knew the silence. They only knew the beautiful, deceptive frost that clung to the pine needles and the profound, heavy peace that had settled in their weary hearts. For now, they were safe. For now, they were just boys in the woods, dreaming of home, wrapped in the quiet, comforting illusion that the world had finally grown tired of breaking itself apart. The night stretched on, peaceful and perfect, keeping its terrible secrets hidden in the deep, frozen shadows of the trees. In the deepest shadows of the frozen earth, a single candle flickers, illuminating the most powerful anchor a soldier possesses, a frayed piece of paper. Outside the dugout, the snow continues its gentle, silent descent, burying the scarred landscape under a veil of pure, undisturbed white. But down here, beneath the frost and the roots of the ancient pines, the world shrinks to the tiny, golden halo of a burning wick. The air is thick, smelling of damp wool, sweet earth, and the metallic tang of cold steel resting quietly against the mud walls. It is here, in this fragile pocket of warmth and artificial peace, that the men turn to the quietest, most sacred ritual of the front line. They reach into the inner pockets of their heavy greatcoats, their stiff, clumsy fingers searching for the small, cherished bundles they keep pressed closest to their hearts. Out come the folded, crumpled pages. Some are blank, waiting for words that are so hard to find, others are already covered in the delicate, looping script of loved ones far away. To write a letter in the quiet of a winter night is an act of profound hope. It is a declaration that there is a tomorrow, that there is a world beyond the freezing trenches, and that the writer will one day return to it. Tonight, surrounded by the deceptive silence that has blanketed the forest, that hope feels more real than it has in months. The guns have been asleep for so long that the men have begun to believe the war itself has grown tired and closed its eyes. Johannes, a man with quiet eyes and hands calloused from years of working wood, balances a small, rough board on his knees to serve as a desk. He holds a stub of a pencil, its lead worn dull. He stares at the blank page, watching the candlelight dance across the creases. What does a man say when the world around him is frozen, but his heart is so full of warmth? He begins to write, not of the cold, nor of the fear that usually hums in the back of his mind. Instead, he writes to his wife, Clara, about the spring. The words flow slowly at first, then with a steady, rhythmic grace. He describes the small garden behind their house, asking if she has turned the soil yet, if the frost has spared the little apple tree they planted together the year before he left. He writes about the smell of the rain on the cobblestones of their street, and how, in the quiet of the night, he can almost hear her singing as she works in the kitchen. With every word, Johannes leaves the cold, dark dugout. He travels across the miles, carried by the graphite on the page, until he is sitting at his own kitchen table, bathed in the morning light. He smiles, a soft, private smile that touches the corners of his eyes. He ends the letter with a promise born from the beautiful, lying silence of the forest outside. The guns are quiet now, my love, he writes. The snow has buried the war. I think, perhaps, the worst is behind us. Keep the fire burning. I will be home to see the apples bloom. A few feet away, huddled in a corner wrapped in a heavy, scratchy blanket, sits young Heinrich. He is barely 18, his face still holding the soft, unlined innocence of youth, though his eyes carry the heavy weariness of an old man. He is not writing to a wife, but to his younger brother. His paper is not pristine, it is torn at the edges, stained with a drop of dried mud. Heinrich's letter is a delicate tapestry of careful omissions. He does not write about the terrifying, thunderous nights of the past autumn. He does not write about the empty bunks, or the friends whose names are no longer spoken aloud. To do so would be to shatter the fragile peace of this winter night, and to burden his brother with a reality too harsh for a child to bear. Instead, he weaves a tale of adventure. He sketches a small, clumsy drawing of a pine tree in the margins, and writes about the beauty of the snow, how it sparkles like crushed diamonds in the moonlight. He tells his brother to be brave, to look after their mother, and to make sure the dog gets an extra scrap of meat from the table. He signs it with a flourish, pressing the pencil hard into the paper, leaving an imprint of his love that will remain long after the graphite fades. In the quiet rustle of paper and the soft scratching of pencils, the dugout becomes a sanctuary. It is a cathedral of memory, where men worship the ordinary, the mundane, the beautiful simplicity of the lives they left behind. There is Stefan, an older soldier with salt and pepper hair, who does not write at all. He simply holds a letter he received 3 weeks ago. It is soft and worn, having been folded and unfolded 100 times. He traces the ink with a trembling finger, feeling the gentle pressure his daughter applied to the pen when she signed her name. He doesn't need to read the words, he knows them by heart. In the flickering candlelight, he closes his eyes and lets the memory of her voice wash over him, a warm, comforting tide that pushes back the biting cold. These pieces of paper, these crumpled, stained, and fiercely protected letters, are the true currency of the front line. They hold more value than a warm meal, more power than a general's orders. They are the fragile threads that connect these men to their humanity, reminding them that they are not just soldiers in a frozen forest, but fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. When we look back through the mists of history at nights like these, it is so easy to lose sight of the men beneath the helmets. The grand sweeping narratives of the war often obscure the deeply personal, quietly devastating reality of the individuals who lived it. We read the sanitized histories, we see the carefully curated photographs, but we so rarely get to witness the unvarnished, raw truth of their daily existence. We rarely see the exhaustion in their eyes, the nervous tremor in their hands as they seal a letter, or the stark, unforgiving environment they called home. It is precisely because I want to honor that hidden reality that I have put together something deeply personal for those of you who wish to see history as it truly was. I have gathered a collection of unseen, raw media, images and footage from the war that are too unvarnished, too real, and too restricted to share on regular platforms. It is a digital collection hosted on Gumroad, designed for those who want to look beyond the textbooks and see the profound, uncensored truth of these young men's lives. It is a way to look them in the eyes and understand the monumental weight of what they carried. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It means the world to me to share this raw history with you safely. Back in the dugout, the candle burns lower, casting long, dancing shadows against the dirt walls. The men begin to finish their quiet task. Johannes carefully folds his letter to Clara, pressing the creases sharp with his thumbnail. He slips it into a small, brown envelope, sealing it with a drop of wax from the candle. He holds it for a moment, pressing it briefly to his lips, sending a silent prayer into the dark before tucking it safely into his tunic pocket, ready for the morning courier. Heinrich blows softly on his letter, drying the heavy graphite of his sketch, before folding it away. Stefan gently returns his daughter's letter to its resting place over his heart, patting his chest once, twice, as if to make sure it is still there. As the letters are put away, a subtle shift occurs in the dugout. The connection to home has been made, the words have been spoken into the void, and a profound, exhausted peace settles over the men. They have unburdened their hearts, pouring their hopes and their hidden fears onto the crumpled paper. Now, they are empty, ready for sleep. The deceptive silence of the forest outside seems to wrap itself around them, a comforting, heavy blanket. They lie down on their thin, scratchy blankets, pulling their collars up against the creeping cold. The rhythm of their breathing slows, matching the gentle, rhythmic fall of the snow above. In the dark, beneath the roots and the frost, they dream. They dream of apple trees blooming in the spring. They dream of cobblestone streets washed clean by the rain. They dream of warm kitchens, of laughter, of a world where the only sound in the night is the gentle breathing of a sleeping child. The wind outside begins a low, mournful sigh through the upper branches of the pines, a sound that rarely penetrates the deep earth where the men lie. When it does, it sounds almost like a lullaby, a soft shushing sound that tells the waking mind to let go of its vigilance. It is a dangerous lullaby, one that lulls the sentries into heavy-eyed stupors and convinces the veterans that their instincts, honed over countless battles, can finally be silenced. Elias, lying near the entrance of the dugout, opens his eyes just a sliver. The candle has finally gutted out, leaving the space in absolute, impenetrable darkness. Yet, the darkness is not frightening tonight. It is a protective cloak. He reaches a hand out in the pitch black, his fingers brushing the rough canvas of the courier bag hanging on a wooden peg. Inside that bag are the souls of 30 men, captured in ink and graphite, waiting to be carried back to a world that makes sense. He feels a profound sense of camaraderie in that bag. He doesn't know what Johannes wrote, or what Heinrich drew, but he knows that every piece of paper in there carries the exact same weight. It is the weight of love. It is the weight of the only thing that truly matters when the world is stripped down to freezing mud and deafening noise. But tonight, there is no noise. There is only the reassuring presence of his brothers in arms, sleeping peacefully beside him. As sleep finally overtakes Elias, he imagines the courier walking through the snow tomorrow, carrying the letters away from the front. He imagines the train journey, the postmaster's stamp, the familiar hand of a village postman dropping the envelopes into mailboxes across the country. It is a comforting chain of events, a tether to normalcy that brings a final, deeply contented sigh to his lips. The forest breathes in, drawing the freezing air deep into its wooden lungs. The snow continues to fall, burying the footprints, burying the trenches, burying the very memory of conflict. The silence deepens, thick, absolute, and utterly profound. It is a beautiful, fragile masterpiece of nature, a moment of perfect stillness before the world turns over. And in that stillness, the men dream on, held gently in the quiet embrace of the winter night, their hearts anchored safely at home by the delicate power of ink on crumpled paper. The only sound left in the frozen world was the soft, rhythmic crunch of boots pressing into fresh snow. If you were to walk alongside him in the deep, velvet darkness of that winter night, you would feel the profound, aching cold seeping through the thickest layers of wool. The forest had transformed into a towering cathedral of ice and timber, where every branch was heavy with crystalline white, and every shadow seemed to hold its breath. This was the century's domain. While the rest of the world sought shelter in the earth, burying themselves beneath roots and soil to find a meager warmth, the century walked the lonely line between the sleeping and the unknown. His name was Karl. He was barely 20 years old, though the deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes made him look much older. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his shoulders hunched against the biting chill, his chin tucked deeply into the rough collar of his greatcoat. His rifle was slung across his back, feeling less like a weapon of war and more like an anchor, a heavy, cold weight tying him to this surreal, frozen landscape. Step after step, the hypnotic crunch of his boots on the powder was the only proof he was not walking through a dream. The snow was untouched here, a pristine blanket that caught the faint, silver light of the moon slipping between the heavy winter clouds. Each time his boot broke the surface, it sounded incredibly loud in the vast, empty quiet of the woods. It was a sound that both comforted and terrified him, a reminder that he was alive, but also a signal to anyone who might be listening in the dark. But tonight, Karl felt an unusual sense of peace. The paralyzing, knotted anxiety that usually accompanied his nightly patrols had slowly melted away, replaced by the mesmerizing beauty of the winter woods. He stopped for a moment, leaning his back against the rough, freezing bark of a giant pine. He pulled down the woolen scarf covering his mouth and nose, letting out a long, slow breath. The air plumed in front of him, a delicate cloud of warmth instantly captured by the freezing night. He looked up into the canopy. The snowflakes were falling so slowly they seemed to float, suspended in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. It was beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that made a man forget, just for a moment, why he was standing in a forest hundreds of miles from home. In the profound silence of a solitary patrol, the human mind cannot help but wander back to the places it loves most. As Karl resumed his slow, rhythmic march, his thoughts drifted away from the front line. He closed his eyes for just a second, letting the gentle crunch of his footsteps transport him back to the snowy streets of his childhood village in the Bavarian hills. He could almost hear the distant, cheerful ringing of the church bells echoing through the valley. He could smell the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted chestnuts and spiced wine wafting from the wooden stalls of the winter market. He remembered the feeling of holding his mother's gloved hand as a little boy, walking through the town square, marveling at the golden light spilling from the windows of the bakery. The snow falling on the front line was the exact same snow that used to blanket his backyard, the same snow he used to pack into spheres and throw at his laughing friends. For a few precious minutes, the war simply ceased to exist. Carl was no longer a soldier guarding a jagged trench line. He was just a boy, taking a quiet, peaceful walk through the winter woods. The towering trees were not cover from artillery, but the familiar, friendly giants of the Black Forest. The moonlight was not a dangerous spotlight, but a gentle guide leading him safely home. He paused again, spotting a set of tiny, delicate tracks crossing his path. A rabbit, perhaps, or a small fox. He crouched down, his stiff knees popping softly in the cold, and traced the shape of the little paw prints with a numbed, gloved finger. It was a tiny, perfect reminder that life stubbornly persisted, even here. The forest was not dead. It was merely sleeping, waiting patiently under the frost for the sun to return. Carl felt a strange, quiet kinship with that little animal, both of them just trying to survive the deep freeze, both of them moving quietly through the dark, seeking safety. When he stood back up, he turned to look back at the faint, almost invisible shapes of the dugouts hidden in the tree line behind him. Somewhere beneath that snow, his friends were sleeping. Johannes, dreaming of his wife's garden. Heinrich, perhaps still holding the letter to his little brother. Elias, the baker's son, finally finding rest from his exhaustion. A profound wave of tenderness washed over Carl. Out here, in the freezing dark, he was their guardian. As long as he walked this line, as long as his boots continued to crunch in the snow, they could close their eyes and believe in the illusion of peace. He bore the cold so they could find warmth. He faced the dark so they could dream of the light. It was a heavy, silent responsibility, but tonight, it filled him with a quiet, noble pride. He was keeping the war away from them, if only for a few more hours. History books rarely record these silent patrols. They tell us of the roaring cannons, the sweeping maneuvers on grand maps, and the dates that changed the world. But they so rarely mention the quiet, heroic crunch of a lonely boy's boots in the snow, or the protective love a sentry feels for his sleeping friends. Reconstructing these delicate, human moments requires sifting through countless forgotten diaries, fading letters, and the quiet, deeply personal memoirs of those who walked the line. Bringing these hidden stories to light, preserving the fragile humanity that existed in the darkest of times, takes an immense amount of time, delicate research, and care. If you find comfort in these soothing stories, and if you value the gentle preservation of these quiet historical moments, I would be deeply grateful if you considered leaving a small tip in my Ko-Fi jar. Even a single dollar helps support the countless hours spent reading through these forgotten pages to bring these peaceful nights to life. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for helping me keep their memories, and these quiet footsteps, softly echoing in our hearts. Carl's patrol brought him to the furthest edge of the line, a small clearing where the trees broke, revealing a vast, gently rolling valley blanketed in undisturbed white. He stood at the edge of the timber, a lone, dark silhouette against the pale snow. Across that valley lay the unseen enemy. For weeks, that horizon had been a source of terror, constantly flashing with the unnatural lightning of artillery fire. But tonight, it was perfectly still. The silence was absolute. There were no flares lighting up the clouds, no distant rumbling of engines, no sharp cracks of sniper fire. The world was at rest. Carl leaned on his rifle, feeling the cold wood of the stock against his heavy mittens, and let the peace of the landscape wash over him. He watched the stars twinkling like scattered diamonds in the clear patches of the night sky. He breathed in the pure, sharp air, feeling it cleanse his lungs, filling him with a sense of pure, unadulterated calm. "It's over," he whispered to himself, the words barely carrying past his own lips before the snow swallowed them. "It has to be over." The thought took root in his heart, growing stronger with every peaceful second that passed. The tension that had held his muscles in a vice grip for months finally released. The enemy across the valley must be feeling the exact same way, huddled in their own trenches, rubbing their own frozen hands, looking up at the exact same stars, and wishing only for the morning light. They were all just boys in the snow, tired, freezing, and desperate for the quiet to last forever. A soft crunching sound approached from his left, breaking his reverie. Carl turned, instinctively gripping his rifle, but his shoulders immediately dropped. It was Felix, the relief sentry, emerging from the shadows of the pines like a ghost wrapped in gray wool. Felix moved with the same slow, hypnotic cadence, his head bowed against the chill. When Felix reached him, the two young men stood face to face in the moonlight. Their breaths mingled in the freezing air between them. They did not salute. They did not speak loudly. The reverence of the silent forest demanded a whisper. "Anything?" Felix asked, his voice rough and thick with sleep, his eyes searching Carl's frostbitten face. Carl shook his head, a small, tired smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Nothing," he whispered back. "Just the snow. Not a single sound all night." Felix nodded slowly, his shoulders visibly relaxing beneath his heavy coat. He patted Carl's arm, a clumsy, patted gesture of affection through their thick mittens. "Go get warm, Carl. The stove is still barely holding on. I'll watch the trees for a while." "Keep warm, my friend," Carl murmured. They traded places, a quiet changing of the guard that happened thousands of times across the frozen frontier. Felix turned his face toward the valley, settling into his lonely vigil, while Carl finally turned his back to the front, heading toward the promised warmth of the earth. The walk back to the dugout felt entirely different. His boots still crunched in the snow, but the sound was no longer a lonely rhythm. It was the sound of going home, of moving toward safety and rest. The trees seemed to part for him, offering a sheltered path through the dark. When he finally reached the low, snow-covered entrance of the dugout, he paused to brush the heavy flakes from his shoulders and helmet. He didn't want to bring the biting cold down into the sanctuary below. He pulled back the heavy canvas flap that served as a door and descended the crude dirt steps. The smell hit him first, the deeply comforting aroma of damp earth, unwashed wool, and the faint, lingering sweetness of pipe tobacco. It was the smell of his brothers. The air down here was thick and warm, a stark, wonderful contrast to the freezing knife edge of the wind above. In the pitch black, he moved entirely by memory and touch, carefully stepping over the sleeping forms of his comrades. He heard the deep, even breathing of Johannes, the soft, rhythmic snoring of Thomas. He found his empty space against the dirt wall and slowly lowered himself to the ground. He unbuckled his webbing, letting the heavy ammunition pouches fall silently into the dirt. He kept his coat on, pulling his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms tightly around his legs to conserve whatever heat he had left. His toes were numb, his fingers stinging as the sluggish blood began to circulate again, but he had never felt so utterly, completely comfortable. He rested his head against the damp earth. The sound of his own heart beating was the loudest thing in the room. He closed his eyes, and the image of the pristine, moonlit snow danced behind his eyelids. The patrol was over. He had walked the line, and the line was safe. The war was sleeping securely beneath the winter frost. As Carl drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the forest outside continued its quiet vigil. The snow fell softly, covering his footsteps, erasing the path he had walked, leaving the world completely smooth and undisturbed. The deceptive peace held the landscape in its gentle embrace, whispering a soothing, deadly lullaby to the boys resting in the dirt, promising them that tomorrow would be just as quiet, just as still, and just as perfectly white as tonight. In the deepest cold, true warmth is not found in the embers of a dying fire, but in the quiet, open hands of a friend. Down in the dim, earthen sanctuary of the dugout, the night had settled into a rhythm of slow, heavy breathing. The men lay shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in every layer of wool and canvas they possessed, seeking refuge in the shared heat of their exhausted bodies. Above them, the thick timber roof creaked ever so slightly under the accumulating weight of the falling snow, a gentle, wooden groan that sounded almost like the earth itself was settling down to sleep. The air inside was still, holding onto the faint, sweet smell of pine sap and the deeply familiar, comforting scent of damp earth. In this pocket of fragile peace, the war felt like a distant rumor. The terrible, tearing sounds of the autumn battles were gone, replaced by the hushed, velvet silence of the winter forest. It was a silence that wrapped around the men like a heavy blanket, lulling them into a state of deep, necessary rest. But for Thomas, the older soldier whose gentle eyes had watched over this small band of brothers for months, sleep remained just out of reach. He lay awake, staring up at the absolute darkness of the ceiling. The cold was a physical presence, a quiet companion sitting in the corner of the dugout, slowly pressing its icy fingers against the walls. But it was not the cold that kept Thomas awake. It was a dull, hollow ache in his stomach. The supply lines had been choked by the deep snowdrifts for days, and the meager rations they carried had slowly dwindled to nothing. Hunger, when it has been with you for a long time, ceases to be a sharp pain. It becomes a quiet emptiness, a heavy fatigue that settles into the very marrow of your bones. Thomas slowly shifted his weight, careful not to disturb the young men sleeping tightly around him. He moved his stiff, gloved hands to the deep pockets of his greatcoat. His fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed against the familiar shapes of spare ammunition and a folded handkerchief. And then, they brushed against something else. Something small, hard, and wrapped in a delicate layer of wax paper. He held his breath, his heart giving a tiny, unexpected flutter of disbelief. He slowly withdrew his hand, pulling the small object from the depths of his coat. In the pitch black of the dugout, he couldn't see it, but his fingers recognized the shape perfectly. It was a small, square block of dark chocolate, a luxury from a parcel sent by his wife so many weeks ago that he had completely forgotten its existence. He had tucked it away for an emergency, a tiny reserve of comfort for a day when the world felt entirely broken. He lay there for a long moment, simply holding the small square in his palm. He could almost smell the rich, bitter cocoa through the paper. His mouth watered, a sudden, desperate urge rising in his throat to tear the paper away and consume the chocolate instantly. It would be so easy. It would provide a fleeting, glorious burst of energy, a moment of pure, selfish comfort in the dark. No one would know. No one would blame him. But as he held the chocolate, he listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the young man lying next to him. It was Leon, a boy who had barely seen his 19th year, a boy whose uniform hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Leon had spent the entire afternoon shivering, his lips a pale shade of blue, trying bravely to hide his deep, bone-rattling exhaustion from the others. Thomas smiled softly in the dark. The urge to eat the chocolate alone vanished, dissolving into the quiet, profound love he felt for these boys. To eat it alone would merely feed his body. To share it would feed his soul. He gently nudged Leon's shoulder. The boy stirred, a soft, confused murmur escaping his lips. "Leon," Thomas whispered, his voice as soft as the falling snow outside. "Leon, wake up for a moment." The boy's eyes fluttered open, trying to adjust to the impenetrable gloom. "Thomas," he whispered back, his voice thick with sleep and the heavy rasp of the cold. "Is it time? Are we moving?" "No, no," Thomas reassured him quickly, keeping his voice to a gentle, soothing murmur. "The line is quiet. The forest is asleep. Just sit up for a moment." Leon slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, the heavy wool blankets shifting around him. He trusted Thomas completely. If the older man told him the night was safe, then the night was safe. Thomas moved his hands in the dark, finding Leon's trembling fingers. "Hold out your hand," he whispered. Leon did as he was told, offering his open palm in the dark. Thomas carefully unwrapped the wax paper. The sound of the crinkling paper was tiny, yet in the absolute silence of the dugout, it sounded like a symphony. He felt for the natural seam in the hard chocolate block and pressed his thumbs against it. With a soft, satisfying snap, the block broke neatly in two. He placed one half into Leon's open hand. "I found this in my coat," Thomas whispered, a smile evident in the warmth of his voice. "A little greeting from home." Leon's fingers closed around the small square. For a moment, he didn't move. He just sat there, breathing in the sudden, miraculous scent of the cocoa that now filled the small space between them. It was a smell completely alien to the damp earth and the cold steel of the trench. It was the smell of bakeries, of Sunday afternoons, of a world that was soft and kind. "Thomas," Leon whispered, his voice trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming swell of emotion. "You should eat this. You need the strength." "We share it," Thomas replied simply, leaving no room for argument. "Now eat. Slowly. Let it melt." They sat together in the pitch black, two soldiers huddled in the freezing earth, lifting the tiny rations to their lips. As the dark chocolate touched his tongue, Leon closed his eyes. He didn't chew. He simply let the warmth of his mouth slowly dissolve the hard square. The taste was incredible. It was intensely rich, slightly bitter, and deeply sweet all at once. As it melted, it didn't just soothe the ache in his stomach, it cascaded through his memory. Suddenly, he was not in a frozen forest. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his mother's house. The stove was radiating a glorious, encompassing heat. The windows were fogged with steam from a boiling kettle. He could hear the gentle clatter of porcelain cups and the soft, comforting hum of his mother singing as she swept the floor. The chocolate was a key, unlocking a door to a beautiful, safe reality that the war had tried so hard to make him forget. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye, rolling warmly down his dirt-streaked cheek. It was a tear of profound gratitude, not just for the food, but for the beautiful, desperate humanity of the man sitting beside him. In a world that had demanded they become hard and unfeeling, Thomas had chosen to remain gentle. He had chosen to share his very last crumb of comfort. It is in these incredibly quiet, hidden moments that the true essence of history is forged. The grand narratives of battles and sweeping maneuvers often overshadow the deeply personal, unfiltered reality of the men who lived it. We rarely get to see the unvarnished truth of a shared piece of chocolate in the dark, or hear the whispered confessions of a boy remembering his mother's kitchen. If you are deeply moved by these hidden truths, and if you want to pull back the curtain on the sanitized versions of the past, there is a place for you to explore deeper. I want to invite you to join our Patreon community. It is a space dedicated to uncensored history, where we share free podcasts that dive into the raw, unblurred realities of the era, and where you can find unrestricted video sections that show the unpolished truth of the front lines. It also serves as a tip jar, allowing us to continue this delicate, deeply emotional research. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for walking this quiet path with us. The chocolate was gone, but the warmth it left behind lingered in the dark. Leon let out a long, slow breath, feeling a sense of deep, unexpected peace settle over his shivering frame. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach had been replaced by a comforting warmth, a small fire lit in his chest by a simple act of grace. "Thank you, Thomas," he whispered into the dark, his voice barely a breath. That was the best thing I have ever tasted." Thomas reached out, his heavy hand finding Leon's shoulder, giving it a reassuring, gentle squeeze. "My wife always said chocolate is better when it is shared," he murmured. She was right. "Now, lie back down, Leon. Try to sleep." The night is still young, and the forest is quiet. Leon nodded in the dark, slowly lowering himself back down onto the damp earth. He pulled his blanket up to his chin, but the cold didn't seem to bite quite as fiercely as it had before. He felt anchored. He felt seen. The terrifying, vast emptiness of the war had been pushed away by the simple, beautiful reality of a friend's kindness. Thomas leaned his head back against the timber wall, listening as Leon's breathing slowly evened out, returning to the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. The older man closed his own eyes, savoring the lingering taste of cocoa in his mouth. He thought of his wife, far away in a world that still had light and warmth. He thought of the letter he would write to her if the morning brought the sun. He would tell her about the snow, and he would tell her that her gift had brought a moment of perfect peace to the dark. Outside the dugout, the deceptive calm of the winter night held strong. The sentries continued their slow, hypnotic walks through the powder, their footsteps muffled by the ever-falling snow. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with white, guarding the sleeping boys below. There were no flashes on the horizon. There were no tremors in the earth. The sky remained a soft, charcoal gray, entirely unbroken by the terrible lightning of the guns. The illusion of safety was perfect, a beautiful, frozen masterpiece that convinced the weary soldiers that the world had finally stopped turning. For the rest of the night, Thomas and Leon slept soundly, wrapped in the comforting illusion of the silence and the lingering warmth of a shared ration. They dreamed of kitchens and gardens, of gentle hands and soft voices. They dreamed of a tomorrow that would be just as quiet, just as peaceful, and just as deeply still as this perfect, frozen night. And as they slept, the snow continued to fall, burying the war, burying the fear, and holding the forest in a deep, heavy slumber. Dawn arrived not with the terrifying thunder of artillery, but with the fragile, forgotten melody of a single winter bird. If you were to open your eyes in that silent forest as the night finally surrendered to the morning, you would see a world painted in the softest shades of lavender and pale blue. The heavy snow that had fallen through the dark hours had finally stopped, leaving behind a pristine, untouched landscape. The clouds parted just enough to let the first, gentle rays of the winter sun filter through the dense canopy of the ancient pines. The light caught the frost on the branches, turning the entire forest into a glittering cathedral of ice and light. Deep in the earth, the men began to stir. There were no shouts, no urgent whistles, no frantic scrambling for helmets and rifles. Instead, there was only the soft rustle of heavy wool blankets being pushed aside and the quiet, morning groans of young men waking from a deep, uninterrupted sleep. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they had slept through the entire night without the earth trembling beneath them. Elias, the baker's son, was the first to emerge from the dugout. He climbed the crude dirt steps slowly, pushing aside the heavy canvas flap that kept the cold at bay. As his head cleared the top of the trench, he stopped and simply stared. The breath caught in his throat. The scars of the war had vanished. The jagged, terrifying craters left by autumn's explosive rain were completely filled with soft, smooth powder. The cruel, rusted tangles of barbed wire had been transformed, the snow had collected on the iron barbs, turning the deadly traps into delicate ribbons of white lace strung between the trees. Even the trench itself, with its muddy walls and crude timber supports, looked like nothing more than a natural, peaceful dip in the snowy earth. Mother Nature had woven a heavy white blanket and pulled it gently over the horrors of the world, hiding them completely from view. Elias pulled his collar up against the morning chill, but the air felt different today. It was biting, yes, but it was incredibly pure, clean, and still. He took a long, slow breath, filling his lungs with the scent of frozen pine needles and cold, damp bark. There was no smell of cordite. There was no acrid smoke burning his eyes. There was only the forest. Slowly, one by one, the other men joined him. Thomas, rubbing the sleep from his kind-lined eyes. Young Leon, clutching the empty wax paper from the chocolate they had shared the night before, a soft, lingering smile on his face. Johannes, his hand resting over the pocket where his newly written letter to his wife sat safely tucked away. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the trench, not as soldiers scanning the horizon for danger, but as boys marveling at the beauty of a winter morning. And then, they heard it. A high, clear, trilling note echoed down from the high branches. The men froze, their eyes searching the canopy. There, perched on a snow-laden branch, was a tiny winter finch. It ruffled its feathers against the cold and let out another sweet, piercing song. To you and me, a bird singing in a tree is the most ordinary thing in the world. But to these men, who had lived for months in a landscape where all wildlife had been driven away by the deafening roar of steel and fire, the song of that tiny bird was a profound, almost miraculous event. It was a message. It was proof that the violent storm had finally passed. Look at him, Thomas whispered, a deep reverence in his voice. He didn't want to speak too loudly, terrified that the sound of a human voice might frighten the delicate creature away. He came back. The birds are coming back. Leon leaned his head back, his young face bathed in the pale morning light, and closed his eyes as the birds sang again. They know, he murmured softly. Animals always know when it's safe. The guns are gone. They have to be gone. This is the beautiful, tragic power of the illusion of silence. The human mind, when pushed to the very limits of exhaustion and fear, will desperately cling to any sign of peace. The silence of the morning, the pristine snow hiding the battle scars, the return of a single, fragile bird, these were all the evidence the men needed to convince themselves that the nightmare was over. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that the great armies had grown tired, that the generals had looked at their maps and decided this small, frozen patch of woods was no longer worth fighting over. The morning unfolded with a lazy, dreamlike quality. The frantic, nervous energy of the front lines simply melted away. Men began to move openly in the trenches, no longer ducking their heads in fear of snipers. They gathered small twigs, carefully shaking the snow from them, and built tiny, smokeless fires in the bottom of the dugout to melt snow in their tin cups. Elias sat on an overturned ammunition crate, watching the water in his dented cup slowly come to a boil. He dropped in a few dried pine needles and a pinch of roasted acorn dust, brewing a warm, earthy tea. He wrapped his freezing, gloved hands around the warm metal, letting the heat seep into his aching joints. Beside him, an older soldier named Matthias was carefully dragging a razor across his cheek, using the reflection of a polished belt buckle as a mirror, humming a quiet folk song from his childhood. It was a scene of domestic tranquility completely out of place in a war zone. They were making homes out of the dirt, finding joy in the simple act of drinking warm water, finding comfort in the soft humming of a friend. They were wrapped in a cocoon of quiet, entirely insulated from the vast, mechanical movements of the world beyond the tree line. There is something deeply fascinating about the things we cannot see, the quiet moments and hidden truths that exist just beneath the surface of history. Just as the pristine snow hid the mud and wire of the battlefield, so much of this monumental conflict was fought not in the roaring open, but in the absolute shadows. While these boys sought peace in a quiet forest, unseen forces, secret communications, and invisible operations were quietly turning the tide of the world in ways that ordinary soldiers could never imagine. If you are drawn to the hidden layers of the past, the quiet secrets that changed the course of everything, I have something special to share with you. I write a weekly email newsletter where we take deep, relaxing dives into the forgotten corners of history. When you join, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a journey into the quiet heroism, the invisible espionage, and the unseen hands that moved the world while the guns were silent. I would love for you to read it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my gift to you, to help you safely explore the hidden depths of the past. Returning to the sunlit trench, the morning hours drifted by like slow-moving clouds. The sun climbed higher into the winter sky, casting long, peaceful shadows across the snow. The frost on the trees began to melt just slightly, sending tiny, sparkling drops of water falling like diamonds through the air. Johannes found a quiet corner of the trench, leaning his back against the earthen wall, his face turned upward to catch the warmth of the sun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter he had written to Clara the night before. He didn't read it again, he simply held the small brown envelope in his hand, feeling a profound sense of closure. He believed that when this letter reached her, the words he had written about the peace of the forest would still be true. He believed the war had finally paused, and that he would soon be walking down their cobblestone street, just in time to see the apple trees bloom. Down the line, a soft, melodic laugh broke the stillness. Two young boys were gently tossing a loosely packed snowball back and forth. They weren't throwing it hard, they were just passing it between them, tossing the soft white powder through the crisp air, their faces relaxed and open. For just this morning, they were not soldiers defending a crumbling empire. They were just boys, playing in the winter snow. The illusion of silence is a powerful, intoxicating thing. It whispers to the weary heart, telling it exactly what it wants to hear. It tells the terrified mind that it no longer needs to be afraid. It tells the exhausted body that it can finally, truly rest. The forest held them in its gentle, freezing embrace. The tiny bird continued its sweet, melodic song from the canopy, weaving a lullaby of peace over the sleeping earth. The men let down their guard completely. They unbuttoned the top collars of their heavy coats. They laid their rifles against the trench walls, out of reach, no longer viewing them as lifelines, but as heavy, useless tools of a bygone time. They did not know that the silence was a lie. They did not know that miles away, just beyond the horizon they could not see, the great steel machines were already moving. They did not know that the world they thought had forgotten them was about to remember them with a terrifying, absolute fury. But for now, in this golden, sunlit morning, the illusion was perfect. The air was still. The snow was beautiful. And the boys in the forest simply sat together, sharing warm tea and soft songs, resting peacefully in the deeply tragic, profound quiet before the storm. Deep beneath the frozen crust of the forest floor, a vibration so faint it felt like a buried heartbeat began to travel through the ancient roots. The afternoon had slowly bled into twilight, painting the winter woods in breathtaking shades of deep violet and bruised blue. Above the trench line, the world was still wrapped in that same profound, delicate silence that had graced the morning. The tiny finch that had sung so sweetly hours before had vanished into the darkening canopy, leaving the snow-laden pines to stand as quiet, towering sentinels against the fading sky. Down in the earthen dugouts, the men were preparing for what they prayed would be another peaceful night. The gentle, domestic rhythm of the day was winding down. Heavy woolen blankets were being shaken free of loose frost and carefully draped over tired shoulders. The faint, sweet smell of a single pipe, packed with the very last crumbs of dried tobacco, drifted lazily through the cold air. It was a moment of profound, quiet comfort. They had survived another day without the sky falling upon them, and the deceptive lull had lulled them into a soft, vulnerable state of grace. Elias, the young baker's son, was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his dugout, his back pressed firmly against a thick, wooden support beam. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a day of simply existing, rather than a day spent running from shadows. He had his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even, listening to the soft murmur of his friends trading quiet stories in the dark. Beside him, resting on an overturned wooden crate, sat his dented tin cup. It was half full of melted snow, left over from their meager midday tea. As Elias leaned his head back, letting his cheek rest against the rough, cold timber of the support beam, he felt something strange. It was not a sound. The air in the dugout was perfectly still. It was a feeling. It was a deep, low resonance that traveled through the frozen earth, up through the buried wooden pillar, and directly into the bone of his jaw. It was a delicate, almost imperceptible shiver. Elias opened his eyes, blinking slowly in the dim light. He thought, perhaps, it was just the heavy, rhythmic beating of his own heart, amplified by the silence and the wood. He held his breath, sitting perfectly still. There it was again. A gentle thrum. A quiet, heavy pulse that seemed to originate from miles and miles away, deep within the bedrock of the valley. He slowly turned his head and looked at the tin cup resting on the crate. The surface of the water was no longer perfectly smooth. In the center of the dark liquid, a tiny, concentric ring was forming, shimmering in the faint light. Then another. A rhythmic, microscopic dance of ripples, born from a tremor that the ears could not yet hear, but the earth could not hide. Elias did not cry out. He did not raise the alarm. To speak of it would make it real, and he so desperately wanted it to be a phantom of his exhausted mind. He looked across the small space at Thomas, the older, quiet father figure of their group. Thomas was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He was staring at the floor, his brow furrowed in a gentle, tragic concentration. He felt it, too. Through the soles of his heavy boots, through the damp earth beneath him, the veteran soldier recognized the ancient, terrible language of the ground. They shared a look across the dim dugout, a silent, heartbreaking conversation that lasted only a second. Thomas offered Elias a small, melancholic smile, a smile that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "I know," the smile said. "I feel it, too. The peace was only a dream." Neither man said a word to young Leon, who was already dozing peacefully in the corner, or to Johannes, who was quietly folding his dry socks. There was no need to steal their final moments of innocent rest. The terrible realization was a burden the older men would carry alone for just a little while longer. This is how the reality of war often returns to those who are waiting for it. It does not always arrive with a sudden, deafening crash. Sometimes, it creeps in through the roots of the trees. It travels through the very mud they sleep on, a physical manifestation of the immense, mechanical weight that is gathering just beyond the horizon. The men in that forest could not see the massive convoys of steel moving into position. They could not see the heavy artillery being dug into the frozen earth miles away. But they could feel the weight of it pressing against the fabric of their quiet world. There is a profound, grounding reality in the things we can touch and feel. Just as Elias felt the history of that moment through the rough timber against his cheek, we too often seek a physical, tangible connection to the past to truly understand it. We want to hold the weight of history in our hands, to see the artifacts, and to immerse ourselves in the authentic stories of those who waited in the dark. If you find yourself longing to connect more deeply with this monumental era, to touch the history we are walking through together, there are beautiful ways to do so. I often recommend exploring the incredible WWII memorabilia available, holding a piece of that time, or watching masterful, emotionally resonant films like Midway on Amazon Prime. It shows the war on a different front, across a vast ocean, yet captures that exact same human experience of waiting for the sudden, terrifying strike of fate. I've gathered some of the most moving, authentic pieces and films in a collection for you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a gentle way to hold history safely in your own home. Back in the quiet, dim space of the earth, the shiver continued. It was not constant, but rhythmic. A slow, methodical beating, like the footsteps of a giant walking softly across the edge of the world. Elias reached out with a trembling, gloved hand and gently placed his fingertips against the dirt wall of the trench. The earth was freezing cold, hard as iron, but it was alive with a subtle vibration. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what was causing it. He pictured great, heavy tracks turning in the snow. He pictured massive brass shells being slid into breaches, the heavy metal doors clanging shut with a finality that made the ground tremble in response. The illusion of silence was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. Above ground, to a casual observer, the forest was still a winter paradise. The stars were beginning to emerge, cold and bright, scattered across the clearing sky. The air was entirely free of smoke. But the earth does not lie. The earth holds the resonance of everything that touches it, and tonight, it was carrying the heavy, mournful news that the lull was over. Thomas slowly leaned forward and opened his rucksack. With quiet, deliberate movements, he pulled out a small, dry pair of woolen socks. He reached over and gently tapped Elias on the knee, offering the socks in the near dark. "Put these on," Thomas whispered, his voice so soft it was barely more than a breath of warm air. "The ground is getting colder tonight." Elias tipped the socks, feeling the rough, warm yarn against his cold fingers. It was a tiny, monumental act of kindness. Thomas was not just giving him dry clothes, he was giving him comfort in the face of the approaching storm. He was telling Elias that no matter what the earth was doing beneath them, they were still together. They still cared for one another. "Thank you," Elias murmured back, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. He quickly unlaced his stiff boots and changed his socks, relishing the fleeting, beautiful warmth against his skin. It was a small luxury, a tiny piece of home right before the world shifted entirely. As Elias pulled his boots back on, he noticed that Johannes had stopped folding his clothes. The woodworker was sitting very still, his head cocked slightly to the side, his eyes wide and fixed on the timber ceiling above. "Do you hear that?" Johannes whispered, his voice trembling like a dry leaf in the wind. Elias and Thomas listened. At first, there was nothing but the sound of Leon's soft breathing. But then, drifting through the cold, still air from far, far across the valley, came a sound so low it was felt more than heard. It was a distant, muffled rumble. A sound like a heavy wooden door being closed deep underground. The shiver in the earth had finally found its voice. The men in the dugout did not panic. There was no sudden rush for their rifles. Instead, a profound, heavy resignation settled over them like a second blanket of snow. The beautiful dream they had lived in for the past 2 days was finally, undeniably over. The war had found them again in the dark. Thomas slowly reached up and buttoned the top collar of his heavy greatcoat, pulling it tight against his throat. He checked the buckle on his helmet strap with slow, methodical fingers. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He was putting his armor back on. He was locking away the gentle father figure who had shared chocolate in the night, and carefully assembling the soldier who would have to survive the morning. Johannes reached into his pocket and touched the letter he had written to Clara. He pressed his fingers against the paper, tracing the invisible ink through the envelope. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent, desperate prayer, asking the universe to carry those words home, no matter what happened when the trembling earth finally cracked open. Elias leaned back against the support beam once more. The vibration was steady now. A constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth and settled deep into his chest. He looked at the tin cup. The tiny, silver ripples were constant, dancing in a frantic, mesmerizing pattern. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet smell of Thomas's empty pipe. He tried to lock that scent into his memory. He tried to remember the exact feeling of the dry socks on his feet and the beautiful, fragile song of the morning bird. He gathered all the peace he had collected over the last 48 hours and buried it deep within his heart, building a small, quiet fortress of memory to protect himself from the noise that was coming. The sentries up on the line stood a little straighter in the dark. They, too, felt the subtle trembling beneath their boots. They looked out across the pristine, moonlit valley, their eyes straining to pierce the deep shadows. The snow was still beautiful. The stars were still shining. But the forest was no longer resting. It was holding its breath. The gentle, soothing calm of the winter night remained visually unbroken, a perfect painting of a silent world. But beneath the surface, the bedrock was shivering, whispering a low, terrible warning to the boys huddled in the dirt. The giant had awakened, and it was slowly, inevitably, walking toward the trees. Even the deepest, darkest winter night can be broken by a false, terrible sunrise. If you were to stand at the edge of the tree line, looking out over the vast, snow-draped valley, you would see a world holding its breath. The profound, velvet darkness that had comforted the weary soldiers for days was still pressing gently against the earth. The stars were still scattered like crushed diamonds across the freezing sky, indifferent to the fragile lives resting in the dirt below. For a long while, the only movement was the slow, rhythmic exhales of the centuries, their breath pluming in the silver moonlight like quiet ghosts. But then, at the very edge of the world, where the dark silhouette of the rolling hills met the ink-black sky, a single, silent flicker of light appeared. It was not the warm, golden promise of the morning sun. It was a sharp, jagged flash of pale, unnatural yellow. It bloomed and vanished in the span of a single heartbeat, so fast that a man might blink and believe he had only imagined it. Carl, the young sentry who had walked the peaceful line just hours before, stood perfectly still. His gloved hands tightened ever so slightly around the cold wooden stock of his rifle. He did not turn away. He kept his tired, aching eyes fixed on the distant horizon, waiting in the biting cold. A minute passed. Then, another flicker. This time, it was slightly brighter, a sudden splash of bruised amber that painted the undersides of the low-hanging clouds. It was followed seconds later by another, and then another, like summer lightning trapped in a freezing, winter world. There was no sound yet. The great distance swallowed the roar of the cannons, leaving only this silent, mesmerizing light show. To a child, it might have looked like a distant festival, a celebration of light against the dark. But to Carl, and to the hundreds of men silently watching from the frozen edge of the forest, it was the undeniable, heartbreaking visual proof that their gentle dream of peace was over. Felix, standing a few paces away, slowly closed the distance between them. The snow crunched softly beneath his heavy boots, a deeply intimate sound against the vast, silent canvas of the flashing sky. When he reached Carl, he did not say a word. He simply stood shoulder to shoulder with his friend, their heavy wool coats brushing against one another, offering the only warmth left in the world, the warmth of shared, quiet endurance. As the flashes grew more frequent, they began to cast long, dancing shadows across the pristine snow of no man's land. The ancient pine trees behind them seemed to lean forward, their silhouettes stretching and shrinking with the pulsing light. The snow, which had been so pure and white in the moonlight, now reflected the sickly, flickering hues of orange and sulphur yellow. It was a terrible, tragic beauty. In the quiet of this silent storm, Carl's mind drifted away from the snow and the cold. He thought of his childhood home in the rolling Bavarian countryside. He remembered sitting on the wooden porch with his father on warm, heavy August nights, watching the heat lightning dance silently across the dark summer sky. His father used to tell him that the angels were taking photographs of the sleeping earth. As a little boy, Carl had found that thought so comforting. He had felt watched over. He had felt incredibly safe. He reached into the deep, woolen pocket of his greatcoat, his numb fingers brushing past extra rifle cartridges until they found what they were looking for. It was a small, smooth wooden carving of a horse, no bigger than his thumb. His grandfather had whittled it for him from a piece of soft linden wood when he was just a child. Carl rubbed his thumb over the worn, polished curves of the wood. It was his anchor. It was a tangible piece of a gentle past, a reminder that the world was not just made of steel and freezing mud. He held it tightly, letting the memory of his father's voice and the safety of that summer porch wrap around his shivering heart. He wished, more than anything, that he could go back to that porch. He wished he could turn away from the flashing horizon, step into the warm kitchen, and close the door on the world forever. But there were no doors here. There was only the snow, the trees, and the flickering sky. Down in the earthen dugouts, safely tucked beneath the roots, the light had not yet penetrated. But the men inside knew. The subtle shiver in the earth had warned them, and now, the heavy, muffled footsteps of the returning sentries confirmed it. Elias sat in the dim glow of a single, sputtering candle. He watched as the heavy canvas flap of the dugout was pushed aside. An older soldier descended the crude dirt steps, bringing with him a swirl of freezing air and a face bathed in pale, exhausted resignation. The soldier didn't speak. He simply found his place against the dirt wall, pulled his knees to his chest, and stared into the flickering candlelight. The silence inside the dugout was no longer the peaceful, resting silence of a winter lull. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. It was the silence of men who have been told a terrible secret and are waiting for the rest of the world to find out. Thomas, the gentle veteran who had shared his last piece of chocolate just the night before, began to move with a quiet, practiced dignity. There was no rush in his hands, no panic in his eyes. He slowly unrolled his canvas webbing, checking the clasps with methodical, steady fingers. He wiped a smudge of dirt from the bolt of his rifle. Every movement was a silent acceptance of the reality they were about to face. He looked over at young Leon, who was sitting very still, his youthful face pale in the dim light. Leon's eyes were wide, staring at the canvas door, as if he could see the flashing sky right through the heavy fabric. Thomas reached out, his large, calloused hand resting gently on the boy's trembling knee. "Breathe, Leon," Thomas whispered, his voice a steady, comforting anchor in the tiny, fragile room. "Just breathe. The sun is still hours away. We are still here. We are still together." Leon swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He leaned into the touch of the older man, drawing strength from Thomas's quiet calm. In these hidden spaces, beneath the earth and away from the sweeping gaze of generals and historians, this is how the war was truly lived. Not with grand speeches or sweeping heroics, but with a gentle hand on a knee, a shared breath in the dark, and a silent promise not to let a friend face the storm alone. It is incredibly difficult to truly comprehend the surreal, terrifying beauty of that flashing horizon, or the profound intimacy of those quiet moments in the dirt. So much of the history we are given has been carefully curated, the roughest edges smoothed away by time and textbooks. We see the dates, we read the maps, but the raw, unvarnished visual reality of the men who stood in that freezing light is often kept locked away in restricted archives. Because I believe that to truly honor these men, we must be willing to see what they saw, I have made a special collection available on Gumroad. It is a digital archive of unseen, raw images and videos from the war, the kind of unfiltered, deeply human media that is too restricted to show on regular platforms. It reveals the harsh, uncensored reality of their days and nights, bridging the gap between the stories we tell and the truth they lived. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a heavy history, but sharing it with you honestly means everything to me. Back on the edge of the forest, the false dawn was growing. The horizon was no longer just flickering, it was alight. A solid, pulsing band of fire stretched across the edge of the valley, pushing the shadows deeper into the woods. The silence had finally broken. It began as a low, continuous rumble, like the sound of a massive, heavy freight train passing miles away in the dark. It vibrated in the soles of the men's boots and rattled the dry, frozen pine needles on the branches above. It was the collective voice of 1,000 great guns, firing in perfect, terrible unison. Carl and Felix did not step back. They stood their ground, their breath pluming together in the cold air, watching the storm gather its strength. The light washed over their faces, highlighting the exhaustion, the youth, and the profound, quiet courage it takes simply to stand and watch the end of a peaceful dream. The snow began to vibrate. Tiny, Crystalline flakes that had settled on the branches shivered and fell, drifting down around the centuries like a second, delicate snowfall. It was as if the forest itself was trembling, reacting to the unnatural light and the deep, rumbling voice of the horizon. In his pocket, Carl's fingers squeezed the little wooden horse so tightly his knuckles ached. He closed his eyes against the pulsing orange light, taking one final, deep breath of the cold, clean winter air. He memorized the smell of the pine, the absolute stillness of the snow, and the quiet presence of his friend beside him. He locked those gentle things safely inside his heart, a tiny, invincible fortress of peace that the approaching fire could never burn away. When he opened his eyes again, the distant rumbling had grown to a dull, sustained roar. The flashes were so bright now that they illuminated the low clouds in violent streaks of crimson and gold. The horizon was fully alight. The beautiful, deceptive illusion of the winter lull had entirely vanished, replaced by the terrifying, awe-inspiring machinery of the world. The storm was awake. And it was walking through the sky, straight toward the quiet, waiting trees. The sky did not break all at once. It began with a single, heavy sigh rushing through the highest branches of the sleeping pines. If you were resting in the deep earth when the illusion finally shattered, you would not have heard a sudden, sharp crack. Because the American guns were miles away, the first herald of their awakening was a strange, rushing wind high above the forest floor. It sounded like the arrival of a massive, unseen flock of birds, their wings cutting through the frigid winter air with a low, mournful tearing sound. Down in the earthen dugouts, the men raised their heads. The dim, sputtering light of their candles danced nervously, reacting to a sudden, invisible change in the air pressure. The heavy silence that had comforted them for so long was abruptly sucked out of the room, leaving behind a vacuum of held breath and widened eyes. Then, the canopy caught fire. The shells did not strike the frozen ground. They were designed to meet the towering, ancient pines high in the air, transforming the majestic roof of the forest into a sudden, terrifying shower of splintered wood and shredded iron. High above the dugouts, blossoms of bright, terrible amber bloomed in the dark. The noise was not a sharp explosion, but a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to press the very air out of the lungs. It was a heavy, rhythmic drumming that echoed through the timber, a massive, mechanical heartbeat that shook the ancient roots of the world. Inside the tiny, subterranean sanctuary, Elias felt a gentle rain of dry soil fall upon his shoulders. He looked up at the thick timber beams supporting the roof of their dugout. They were groaning softly, shifting under the sudden, immense weight of the displaced air and the raining debris. There was no shouting. The noise above was too vast, too absolute, to fight with human voices. Instead, a profound, immediate instinct took over. The men curled inward, making themselves as small as possible, seeking the deepest, darkest corners of their earthen walls. They pulled their heavy woolen collars high around their ears and drew their knees tightly to their chests. Thomas, the gentle veteran whose quiet strength held them all together, did not retreat into a corner. He moved through the trembling dirt space, finding young Leon in the gloom. The boy was shaking, his eyes squeezed tightly shut against the rolling thunder above. Thomas knelt beside him, wrapping his large, heavy arms around the boy's shoulders. He pulled Leon's head against his chest, tucking him beneath the thick fabric of his own greatcoat. It was an act of pure, fatherly love, a silent, physical promise to shield the boy from the falling sky, to absorb the fear so the young man wouldn't have to carry it all himself. Outside, the forest was weeping. The towering pines, some of which had stood for over a century, were being systematically dismantled by the invisible storm. When a shell detonated in the upper branches, it sent a shower of jagged, razor-sharp wood cascading down into the snow. It was a golden, lethal rain of fresh pine sap and shattered bark. The scent of it was overwhelming, the sharp, sweet perfume of the broken trees mixing heavily with the bitter, metallic tang of cordite and ozone. Johannes pressed his back against the earthen wall, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His fingers found the small, brown envelope he had sealed the night before. He gripped the letter to his wife so tightly that his knuckles ached. In the face of such overwhelming, impersonal machinery, that thin piece of paper felt like his only tether to reality. He closed his eyes and began to silently mouth the words he had written to Clara. He recited them like a prayer, over and over, letting the memory of his own handwriting build a wall between his mind and the thunder in the canopy. "The guns are quiet now, my love," his mind whispered, desperately clinging to the beautiful lie he had believed just hours ago. "Keep the fire burning. I will be home to see the apples bloom." To survive a moment like this, when the world above is completely tearing itself apart, the human mind must travel away from the body. It must find a quiet room somewhere deep inside, a sanctuary where the noise cannot reach. Elias closed his eyes and let his head rest against the trembling timber. He focused on the rhythmic, heavy thumping above, and he began to change it in his mind. He stripped away the war. He slowed the rhythm down. In his imagination, the deep, rolling concussions became the heavy, comforting sound of his father's fists kneading dough on the massive wooden tables of their bakery. The shaking of the earth became the familiar rumble of the great stone ovens being stoked for the morning bread. The sharp smell of pine and cordite faded, replaced by the warm, sweet, intoxicating aroma of rising yeast and melted butter. He stayed there, in that warm, flour-dusted room of his memory. He watched his father's hands moving with practiced grace. He felt the heat of the oven against his face. It was so real, so deeply comforting, that a soft, peaceful sigh escaped his lips, completely lost beneath the roaring sky. It takes an extraordinary resilience to find a gentle memory while the world is falling. When we read the faded, fragile diaries of the men who sat in those trembling dugouts, we do not just find stories of fear. We find these incredible, deeply human moments of retreat. We find boys holding hands in the dark, and men reciting poetry to themselves to keep their minds unbroken. Bringing these deeply intimate, quiet acts of survival to light requires sifting through hundreds of forgotten journals, translating the hurried, terrified handwriting of boys who simply wanted to remember their mother's kitchens. This meticulous, emotional work of preserving the fragile humanity hidden beneath the roar of history takes an immense amount of time and care. If you find peace in these stories, and if you believe in the value of keeping these quiet, human moments alive for future generations, I would be deeply honored if you considered leaving a small tip in my Ko-Fi jar. It directly supports the massive research and the quiet hours spent unearthing these gentle truths. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Your support is a beautiful way to ensure these quiet voices are never drowned out by the thunder of the past. The barrage continued, relentless and mesmerizing in its heavy cadence. The canopy above was catching the worst of the storm, the ancient trees acting as a tragic, noble shield for the boys buried beneath their roots. With every deep concussion, the air in the dugout compressed and released, a physical pushing and pulling that made the men feel as though they were trapped inside a massive, breathing lung. The single candle finally gave up, snuffed out by a sudden drop in pressure, plunging the tiny earthen room into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Yet, the darkness was almost a relief. Without the dim light to show the dust falling from the ceiling or the strained, pale faces of their friends, the men could sink even deeper into their internal sanctuaries. Thomas kept his arms tightly wrapped around Leon. In the pitch black, he began to hum. It was barely audible, a low, resonant vibration in his chest rather than a sound in the air. It was a simple, repetitive lullaby from his own childhood, a song meant to soothe a restless infant. Leon could not hear the melody over the thunder in the trees, but he could feel the gentle vibration against his cheek. He pressed himself closer to the older man, letting that soft, rhythmic humming become his entire world. It was a tether of pure humanity, a lifeline of warmth in a freezing, shaking void. There is a profound, quiet grace in enduring. They could not fight back against the sky. They could not run, for stepping out of the dugout would mean walking into a lethal rain of jagged wood and steel. All they could do was sit in the dark, hold onto their memories, and wait. The forest above was being permanently altered. The beautiful, pristine blanket of snow was now churned with dark earth, shattered branches, and the tragic debris of the ancient pines. The delicate ribbons of frost that had decorated the trees were entirely vaporized, replaced by the harsh, bitter smoke of the exploding shells. But down in the dirt, the boys remained unbroken. They breathed the damp, dusty air. They held onto the smooth wooden carvings in their pockets, the letters folded against their chests, and the hands of the men beside them. They were small, fragile things caught in the gears of a massive, mechanical storm, but their hearts were insulated by the incredible, stubborn power of their own memories. Elias stayed in his father's bakery. Johannes stayed in the garden with Clara. Leon stayed wrapped in the protective, fatherly warmth of Thomas's coat. The thunder rolled on through the canopies, a deep, heavy drumbeat that shook the earth. But beneath the roots, in the quiet, absolute dark, the human spirit simply closed its eyes, wrapped itself in the gentle comfort of home, and waited patiently for the storm to pass. When the light vanishes completely, the hands become the eyes of the soul. In the sudden, absolute blackness of the earthen dugout, the world instantly shrank to the space a single man could reach. The solitary, flickering candle, their fragile, artificial sun, had been violently snuffed out by the concussive breath of the falling sky. Now, there was nothing but a pitch-black void. The air grew immediately thick, heavy with the smell of displaced, ancient earth, the sharp perfume of shattered pine needles, and the bitter, metallic tang of an approaching storm. The thunder rolled on high above them, a continuous, heavy beating against the fragile roof of the forest, but down here, beneath the frozen roots, the men were submerged in a silent, suffocating sea of velvet shadow. The mind, when plunged so suddenly into absolute darkness, does not always race into panic. Sometimes, as a gentle mercy, it slows down. It turns every movement into a deliberate, heavy task, as if walking through deep, freezing water. This scramble in the dark was not a frantic, chaotic rush of running boots and shouted orders. There was no room for that in the narrow, trembling walls of the subterranean trench. Instead, it was a quiet, desperate, almost graceful fumbling. It was the soft sound of heavy woolen sleeves brushing against dry dirt, the metallic, delicate clink of a chin strap being fastened by trembling, blind fingers. It was a scramble of the spirit, a slow, methodical gathering of the self, trying desperately to piece together the shattered illusion of the winter peace. Johannes knelt in the soft, freezing dirt, his bare hands sweeping frantically across the uneven floor. He was not looking for his heavy helmet. He was not looking for his rifle. In the terrifying moment the light died and the earth shook, the small, brown envelope he had written to his wife had slipped from his grasp. For Johannes, losing that letter in the dark was far more terrifying than the immense, mechanical thunder tearing through the canopy above. That paper was his tether to Clara. It was his physical anchor to a world that was still gentle, a world that still made sense. His calloused fingers brushed past empty brass casings, smooth, freezing stones, and damp clumps of clay. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, loud in the enclosed space. He imagined the letter being trampled into the mud, the delicate loops of his handwriting buried and lost forever in this terrible place. And then, his fingertips grazed it. He felt the crisp, delicate edge of the paper. He pulled it to his chest with a sudden, overwhelming relief, brushing the loose soil from it with a gentle, reverent touch. He unbuttoned the top of his heavy coat and slipped the envelope beneath his wool tunic, placing it flat against his bare skin, right over his heart. He let the steady, rhythmic pulse of his own life keep the words warm. Only then, with his soul secured, did he reach out into the dark for his weapon. Across the tiny space, Elias moved by memory alone. He had lived in this subterranean room for weeks, and his hands knew the topography of the dirt walls perfectly. He felt his way along the rough, splintering timber supports, his fingertips reading the grain of the wood like a blind man reading a deeply familiar map. He found his helmet resting on an overturned crate. The cold steel was a shocking contrast to the warm, damp air he breathed out. As he pulled the heavy leather strap beneath his chin, he closed his eyes, even though the darkness around him was total. He listened to the breathing of the men around him. Stripped of his sight, his hearing became incredibly acute. He could distinguish his friends just by the sound of their breath. Thomas, slow, deep, and measured, like the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Johannes, quick and relieved, settling into a rhythm. Leon, shallow, fast, and trembling like a trapped bird. In the terrifying, shaking dark, that collective, human breath was a beautiful, comforting symphony. It was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. It meant they were all still breathing. It meant he was not alone in the void. In the farthest corner, wrapped deeply in the thick, heavy wool of a shared greatcoat, Thomas held tightly onto young Leon. The boy was frozen. His young mind was simply unable to process the violent, heartbreaking transition from a peaceful, sunlit winter morning to this deafening, trembling nightmare. The beautiful finch that had sung in the canopy was gone, replaced by a rain of jagged steel. Thomas did not push the boy. He did not issue stern commands or demand bravery. Instead, the older veteran became a steady, immovable rock in the shifting, terrifying dark. He reached out and took Leon's small, freezing hands in his own massive, calloused ones. He placed them gently onto the cold, polished wood of the boy's rifle. He guided Leon's fingers to the bolt, to the smooth curve of the trigger guard, gently reminding the young body of its purpose when the mind was lost to fear. Thomas leaned his head forward, his helmet clinking softly against Leon's in the dark. "I am right here," Thomas whispered, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that Leon could feel in his chest, cutting perfectly beneath the roaring canopy above. "Take your time, my boy. Do not think about the sky. Think about the wood in your hands. Feel the steel. Just find your breath. I am right here, and I am not letting you go." It is a strange, beautiful tragedy that the most profound moments of human connection often happen in the darkest, most terrifying places. In that pitch-black dugout, entirely stripped of the comforting light of the sun, and violently robbed of the illusion of peace, these men were reduced to their purest, most essential selves. They were no longer soldiers of a grand empire, serving a map they had never seen. They were simply brothers. They were defined entirely by the gentle touch of a hand in the blackness, the sharing of a warm coat, and the quiet, loving reassurances whispered into the trembling void. The grand, sweeping histories of the world rarely, if ever, capture these deeply intimate moments. They record the movement of the storm, the dates of the bombardments, and the shifting lines of the territory, but they so often forget the boys huddled in the dirt, holding onto each other in the absolute dark. It is this hidden, deeply emotional reality that I am so passionate about preserving. The true story of this era is not just found in the flashes of light on the horizon, but in the unvarnished, uncensored humanity of the shadows. If you find comfort in uncovering these forgotten truths, and if you wish to see history as it truly was, raw, deeply personal, and profoundly human, I invite you to join our Patreon community. It is a quiet sanctuary where we share free podcasts diving deeply into the raw, unblurred realities of the era. It is a place for uncensored video sections that show the true, unpolished face of the front lines, and it serves as a tip jar to support the massive, delicate research it takes to lovingly craft these stories. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for walking into the dark with me, and for helping keep these quiet memories alive. Slowly, the gentle fumbling in the dugout ceased. The scramble was finally over. Every man had found his gear, his weapon, and his place against the freezing dirt wall. They sat in a tight, unbroken line, their shoulders pressed firmly together. The physical contact was an absolute lifeline. Through the thick, damp layers of wool and canvas, they could feel the subtle shivering of the man beside them. They could feel the shared, heavy tension, the collective gathering of whatever courage they had left. The darkness no longer felt like a suffocating blanket, it felt like a protective, heavy shield. As long as they stayed in the dark, hidden beneath the earth, they felt a fragile, fleeting sense of safety. The thunder above continued to tear the beautiful winter forest apart, shaking the earth with a violent, mechanical fury that vibrated deep in their bones. Loose, dry dirt continued to sift down from the groaning timber beams, dusting their helmets and shoulders like a warm, brown snow. But they did not look up. They kept their heads bowed, their eyes closed, living entirely in the small, tactile world of their own hands and the beautiful, reassuring warmth of the men beside them. Elias reached out into the blackness, his thick, woolen glove finding the empty, freezing air in front of him. He moved his hand slowly, carefully to his left, until his fingers brushed against the rough, damp fabric of Johannes's sleeve. He didn't grab the arm, he simply let his fingers rest there, a silent, gentle anchor in the shifting sea of the earth. A moment later, Elias felt a larger, heavier hand rest gently on his own right shoulder, Thomas, reaching out from the other side, silently completing the connection. They were a human chain of warmth in a freezing, trembling world. They sat in the pitch black, listening to the heavy, concussive breathing of the artillery, and the soft, terrified breathing of each other. The illusion of the beautiful, quiet winter was dead, and the storm they had all dreaded had finally, inevitably arrived. But in the deepest, darkest corner of the earth, they were holding fast. They were ready for whatever the violent dawn might bring, not with the fierce, unyielding bravado of storybook warriors, but with the quiet, unbreakable, deeply beautiful resilience of ordinary boys who simply refused to let each other face the dark alone. When the world outside is made entirely of thunder, the quietest place left is the human heart. The sky above the forest had completely forgotten how to be still. What began as a sudden, shattering shock had slowly transformed into a continuous, heavy rhythm. The falling shells no longer felt like individual strikes, they had merged into a singular, rolling wave of pressure that pushed down upon the ancient pines. It was a steel rain, a relentless downpour of iron and fire that turned the beautiful, snow-covered canopy into a churning ocean of sound. Yet, down in the deep, velvet blackness of the earthen dugout, the violent noise of the surface was muffled, filtered through feet of frozen mud and heavy roots, reaching the men as a deep, resonant echo. To be trapped beneath the earth while the sky falls is to exist in a state of suspended animation. The physical world shrinks to nothing more than the few inches of space in front of your face. You cannot walk. You cannot stand. You can only sit in the pitch dark, shoulder to shoulder with the ghosts of your friends, and listen to the trembling of the world. The air inside the dugout was thick and heavy, tasting of pulverized dry clay and the bitter, metallic ash of the bombardment. With every deep concussion that rolled across the forest floor above, a gentle, ghostly shower of fine dirt would sift down from the wooden ceiling beams. It fell upon their woolen shoulders and heavy steel helmets like a warm, brown snow. It coated their eyelashes and gathered in the deep creases of their worn coats. In the absolute darkness, they could not see the dust falling, but they could feel it, a soft, constant reminder that the earth holding them was bruised and shifting. For Johannes, the woodworker, the darkness was no longer a terrifying void. He had made his peace with it the moment his searching fingers had found the precious, folded envelope in the dirt. With his letter to Clara safely tucked inside his tunic, pressed flat against the warm, beating drum of his own chest, he felt a strange, heavy armor wrap around his soul. He leaned his head back against the trembling dirt wall and closed his eyes. If you listen to a terrible noise for long enough, the human mind, in its infinite mercy, will try to turn it into a song. Johannes focused on the rhythmic, muffled thumping of the steel rain above. He took slow, deliberate breaths, and he began to weave a memory over the reality. He imagined that he was not in a freezing, shaking trench, but lying in the soft, feather bed of his childhood home. He imagined that the deep concussions above were not artillery shells, but the heavy, comforting roll of a late summer thunderstorm passing over the valley. He pictured the warm, fat drops of August rain drumming against the tin roof of the barn. He could almost smell the wet hay, the sweet, heavy scent of the damp soil in his mother's garden, and the clean, fresh ozone of the summer wind. He let the memory pull him completely out of the dark. He rode the echoes of the bombardment back in time, letting the vibration in the earth become the gentle rattling of the window panes in his old bedroom. He smiled softly in the unseen dark. His hands relaxed their tight grip on his knees. He found a profound, unshakable sanctuary within his own mind, a quiet room built of love and memory where the steel rain could never, ever reach him. Beside him, the rhythm of the dugout was kept by the slow, steady voice of Thomas. The older veteran had not moved from his protective embrace of young Leon. He kept the boy tucked beneath the heavy fold of his greatcoat, sheltering him from the falling dust and the terrifying pressure of the enclosed space. Leon was shivering, a fine, continuous tremble that shook his small frame like a leaf caught in a harsh wind. He was too young to have a vast library of peaceful memories to retreat into. His mind was trapped entirely in the terrifying present, snagged on the jagged edges of the noise and the dark. Thomas knew this. He knew that if he let the boy listen to the echoes of the artillery, the terror would eventually hollow him out. So, Thomas gave the boy a different echo to listen to. He leaned his lips close to Leon's ear and began to speak, his voice a low, rumbling whisper that carried the gentle warmth of a hearth fire. "Do not listen to the sky, Leon," Thomas murmured smoothly, his breath warm against the boy's cheek. "Listen to me. I want to tell you about the forest near my home. I want to tell you how it looks when the first snow falls, before anyone has walked upon it." Thomas described the tall, silver birch trees of his youth. He painted a picture in the dark, speaking slowly and deliberately, pausing only when the earth gave a particularly violent shudder. He talked about the quiet, majestic deer that would step softly through the powder, their breath pluming in the crisp morning air. He described the way the ice would form on the edges of the little creek behind his house, creating delicate, crystalline patterns that looked like spun glass. Leon stopped shivering. He closed his eyes and leaned his weight entirely against Thomas's broad chest. He grasped the older man's words like a lifeline, pulling himself out of the freezing mud and into the beautiful, painted world of Thomas's past. The soothing cadence of the veteran's voice became a shield, deflecting the terror of the bombardment and replacing it with a soft, hypnotic comfort. It is a profound act of everyday heroism to lend someone your own peace when theirs has been stolen. Thomas had very little left to give. He had no food, no warmth, and no power to stop the sky from falling. But he had his memories, and he had his voice, and in the absolute darkness of that buried room, that was enough to save a young man's soul. There is a deeply moving comfort in knowing that even in the most unimaginably terrifying moments of history, men survived by creating these hidden sanctuaries in their minds. They endured the visible, deafening war by retreating into an unseen, quiet world of secrets and whispered stories. Much of what truly shifted the tides of this era did not happen in the roaring light of the battlefields, but in the quiet shadows, away from the eyes of the world. Hidden operations, secret communications, and the quiet courage of unseen individuals played a monumental role in shaping the history we now know. If you are drawn to the hidden layers of the past, and to the quiet secrets that changed the course of everything, I have something special I would love to share with you. I write a weekly email newsletter where we take deep, relaxing dives into the forgotten, shadowy corners of history. When you join, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a gentle journey into the quiet heroism and the unseen hands that moved the world while the guns were firing. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my gift to you, to help you safely explore the hidden depths of the past. As the hours stretched on, the barrage above seemed to lose its frantic, chaotic anger, settling instead into a heavy, methodical labor. The echoes of the steel rain became the new, strange heartbeat of the forest. Elias sat quietly on the other side of the dugout, his hands resting lightly on the cold dirt floor. He had moved past fear, and past the need for memory. He had entered a strange, almost transcendent state of acceptance. He realized, with a profound clarity, that there was absolutely nothing he could do to alter the course of the storm above. He could not stop the shells. He could not reinforce the timber. He was a passenger in the earth. With that realization came a sudden, washing wave of physical relief. The agonizing tension that had gripped his muscles for hours simply evaporated. He let his shoulders slump. He let his chin rest upon his chest. He breathed in the dusty, heavy air, and he simply surrendered to the moment. He listened to the symphony of the dark. He heard the muffled thunder of the horizon. He heard the gentle, persistent sifting of the dirt raining down from the ceiling. He heard the soft, steady murmuring of Thomas telling his quiet story to Leon. And he heard his own, even breath. He felt a deep, overwhelming love for the boys in the dark with him. Stripped of the sun, stripped of the sky, and buried beneath the shaking roots, they were entirely pure. They were nothing but heart and breath. Elias reached out his hand, just a few inches, until his fingertips brushed against the rough wool of Johannes's coat. He felt the slow, steady rise and fall of his friend's breathing. Johannes did not speak, but he gently shifted his weight, pressing his shoulder just a fraction closer to Elias, acknowledging the touch in the dark. The steel rain did not wash the earth clean, it buried the world under a heavy blanket of sound. But beneath that blanket, wrapped in the roots and the freezing clay, the men did not break. They bent. They retreated into the quiet, untouchable sanctuaries of their own minds. They wrapped each other in whispered stories and gentle, unseen touches. The bombardment would eventually end. The sky would eventually run out of fire. But until that moment arrived, the boys in the dugout would simply wait. They would endure the trembling earth, carrying the quiet, beautiful light of their own humanity safely through the deepest, darkest echoes of the storm. When the world outside loses its mind, the quietest souls must anchor themselves to a single, gentle truth. The heavy, rhythmic drumbeat of the falling sky began to change. For what felt like a lifetime, the boys hidden beneath the roots of the ancient forest had lived inside a deep, continuous earthquake. The artillery had been a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed them into the dark dirt, forcing them to retreat entirely into the quiet, safe sanctuaries of their own minds. But now, the deep, mechanical thunder was slowly lifting. The shells were no longer falling directly onto the shattered canopy above their heads. The invisible giants were throwing their terrible fire further back, deeper into the woods behind the German lines. To the untrained ear, the fading of the heavy artillery might have sounded like a reprieve. It might have felt like the end of the storm. But down in the earthen dugouts, the sudden shift in the air pressure brought a new, distinct kind of heavy silence. It was the silence of a drawn breath. The veteran soldiers, men like Thomas, whose eyes had seen the turning of too many seasons in the mud, knew exactly what this subtle shift meant. The heavy rain of steel had washed the forest clean, and now, the flood was coming. A new sound began to filter down through the wooden support beams and the frozen clay. It was not the monolithic, solitary roar of the great guns. It was a chorus. It was a massive, chaotic symphony of 1,000 different noises blending into a rushing, terrifying tide. There was the sharp, rhythmic crack of distant rifles, sounding like dry branches snapping in a winter fire. There was the low, guttural growl of heavy engines pushing through the snowdrifts, and the faint, overlapping echoes of voices calling out in a language these boys did not understand. It was a chorus of chaos. The American advance had begun. In the pitch black of the dugout, the profound, resting stillness was broken. But it was not broken by panic. When the human mind is confronted with an overwhelming tide of noise and confusion, it often does not shatter. Instead, it narrows. It focuses entirely on the space a man can reach with his own two hands. Elias opened his eyes in the dark. He could not see the dirt walls, nor the faces of his friends, but he could feel the sudden, electric change in the atmosphere. The heavy, protective weight of the earth suddenly felt incredibly fragile. The chorus above was a vast, sprawling ocean, and their tiny dirt room was nothing more than a delicate wooden ship caught in the very center of the maelstrom. He felt a hand brush against his shoulder. It was Thomas. The older man's touch was not frantic, it was firm, grounding, and incredibly gentle. It was a silent command passed in the dark. It is time to wake up. It is time to leave the sanctuary. Elias slowly pushed himself up from the cold floor. His limbs were stiff, heavy with exhaustion and the lingering, numbing cold of the earth. He reached down and found his helmet, the smooth, freezing steel feeling completely alien after hours of dwelling in the warm, flour-dusted memories of his father's bakery. He placed it on his head, fastening the leather strap beneath his chin with slow, deliberate fingers. Every simple movement required an immense, conscious effort, as if he were moving through deep water. Rational thought, the kind of thought that worries about the future or regrets the past, was completely washed away by the rushing noise above. What remained was pure, unadulterated instinct. But it was not the instinct of a predator, it was the instinct of a brother. Johannes, the gentle woodworker, stood up beside him. Johannes did not check the bolt of his rifle first. Instead, he unbuttoned the top of his heavy woolen coat and pressed his bare hand against his chest, feeling the smooth, crisp edges of the letter he had written to his wife, Clara. He pressed it deeply against his skin, feeling the steady, rapid beating of his own heart against the paper. That letter was his shield. It was the only armor that truly mattered. As long as those words were safe against his chest, a part of him remained entirely untouchable by the chorus of chaos outside. Across the small space, Thomas was quietly helping young Leon to his feet. The boy was still trembling, a fine, continuous shiver that shook his narrow shoulders. The noise of the advancing infantry was a terrifying, formless monster to the young man. Thomas did not tell him to be brave. He simply reached out and adjusted the heavy collar of Leon's greatcoat, folding it up tightly around the boy's ears to muffle the sound. He brushed the loose, fallen dirt from the boy's shoulders with the tenderness of a father brushing snow from his child's coat. "Stay close to me," Thomas whispered, his deep voice cutting through the rising tide of noise like a warm, heavy bell. "Do not look at the whole forest. Just look at my back. Just follow my boots." Leon nodded, his eyes wide in the gloom. He gripped his rifle not as a weapon, but as a walking stick, a heavy piece of wood and iron to keep him from blowing away in the storm. In moments of overwhelming, incomprehensible chaos, the human heart desperately clings to the tangible. A folded letter, a heavy wool collar, the reassuring weight of a friend's hand in the dark. These small, physical objects and gentle touches ground the spirit when the entire world seems to spin violently out of control. It is a deeply human need to hold on to something real when history is crashing like a wave all around you. Today, as we look back on these profound, earth-shattering moments, we too seek out the tangible to help us understand the vast scope of the past. We want to touch the history, to see the reality of the grand tides that swept these gentle boys into the storm. For those who find comfort and meaning in preserving this connection, I often recommend exploring the incredible WWII memorabilia available, holding a small piece of that era in your own hands. Alternatively, immersing yourself in masterfully crafted films like Midway on Amazon Prime allows you to witness the breathtaking scale and deeply personal sacrifices of the war on a different front, reminding us of the universal, shared human experience of facing the overwhelming tide. I have found some deeply moving, authentic resources for you to explore this history. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my way of helping you safely anchor yourself to the incredible history we share. Slowly, the men began the short, heavy climb up the crude dirt steps, leaving the protective darkness of the dugout to return to the trench line. Elias pushed aside the heavy canvas flap. The air that greeted him was no longer the pure, biting cold of a pristine winter morning. It was thick, warm, and choked with the bitter, gray ash of shattered pine trees and burned powder. The beautiful, undisturbed blanket of white snow had been completely erased. The landscape was churned into a tragic, jagged sea of dark earth and splintered, weeping timber. The pale, gray light of the morning struggled to pierce the thick canopy of smoke that hung low over the valley. It cast a ghostly, surreal pallor over the woods, turning the towering, ancient trees into fading, indistinct silhouettes. As Elias stepped into the shallow trench, the chorus of chaos washed over him completely. The noise was no longer muffled by the earth, it was immediate, vast, and entirely encompassing. It was a rushing wall of sound that drowned out his own breathing. The distant shouts, the roar of engines, the sharp cracking of the infantry advance, it all blended into a single, overwhelming white noise. He leaned his back against the cold, damp earth of the trench wall. He looked down the line at the boys emerging from the earth. They looked like ghosts rising from the ashes. Their faces were pale beneath the smudges of dark dirt, their eyes wide and trying desperately to focus in the hazy, confusing gloom. Rational thought requires space, and in that trench, there was no space left. There was only the immediate, pressing reality of the next second. Elias did not think about the grand strategies of generals, or the shifting lines on a map hundreds of miles away. He thought only about the small, smooth stone he kept in his left pocket. He reached in and turned it over and over with his thumb. It was a stone from the riverbed near his bakery, perfectly rounded by years of gentle, flowing water. He focused entirely on the smooth texture of the rock, letting its quiet, ancient permanence steady his racing pulse. A few feet away, Thomas guided Leon into position. The older man stood tall, his broad shoulders shielding the boy from the worst of the ash drifting down from the sky. Thomas did not look out over the parapet with anger or aggression. His face held only a profound, heavy sorrow. He watched the thick smoke drifting through the shattered tree trunks, waiting for the shadows to take human form. The American soldiers advancing through the mist were just like them, tired, freezing, and terrified boys who had been asked to walk into the teeth of a winter storm. The chorus of chaos belonged to all of them. It was a shared tragedy, a terrifying symphony composed by machines, played by young men who simply wanted to go home. In the midst of the deafening roar, Johannes looked over at Elias. The noise was too great for words to carry even a few feet. So, Johannes simply reached out his hand and rested it on Elias's shoulder. He gave the heavy wool a firm, slow squeeze. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking gesture. In the center of a world that was tearing itself apart, surrounded by a chorus of absolute, unyielding chaos, that single squeeze spoke a volume of quiet poetry. It said, "I am here. You are not alone. Whatever emerges from the smoke, we will face it together." Elias nodded slowly, placing his own hand briefly over Johannes's. They turned their faces forward, toward the rolling, smoke-filled valley. The forest was no longer a silent sanctuary, and the deceptive frost was gone forever. The world was awake, and it was screaming. But inside their heavy coats, beneath the dirt and the ash, their hearts beat in a steady, resilient rhythm. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the gray morning light, anchored to each other, carrying their quiet, gentle memories into the blinding center of the storm. Out of the thick, gray mist, the ghosts of the winter morning finally took human shape. The tremendous, mechanical roaring of the sky had slowly rolled away, leaving behind a forest that was profoundly, irrevocably changed. The beautiful, pristine snow that had blanketed the earth just a few hours ago was gone. In its place was a landscape painted entirely in shades of charcoal, ash, and a pale, haunting gray. The air itself had become thick and heavy, saturated with the pulverized breath of ancient pine trees, damp earth, and the lingering, bitter mist of the bombardment. It was a fog so dense that it seemed to swallow the morning light, turning the sun into nothing more than a pale, distant smear behind a curtain of smoke. Down in the shallow, trembling trench, the boys pressed themselves against the cold mud. They were completely silent, their breath pluming in the chill air, catching the gray ash as it drifted lazily down from the shattered canopy. The world had shrunk once again. They could not see the horizon. They could not see the distant hills. They could only see the 50 yards of torn, smoking earth immediately in front of them, and the thick, swirling wall of mist that marked the edge of the unknown. Elias leaned his head against the damp wall of the trench. His eyes, rimmed with the deep, dark shadows of exhaustion, strained to pierce the veil of smoke. The chorus of chaos they had heard moments before, the distant shouts, the rumbling engines, had strangely faded, muffled by the incredible density of the fog. Now, there was only the soft, unsettling sound of the ash falling, and the slow, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots moving through the debris. They were coming. But they did not come as a roaring, terrifying wave of conquerors. As the smoke slowly began to parting like the heavy curtains of a darkened stage, Elias saw the first silhouette. It was just a shadow at first, a dark smudge against the pale mist. Then, another shadow appeared beside it. And another. They moved slowly, cautiously, their shapes blurring and shifting in the heavy air. They were not running. They were walking with the heavy, burdened steps of men who were carrying the exact same exhaustion, the exact same bone-deep cold, as the boys waiting for them in the trench. Elias watched the shadow in the center. As the figure drew closer, the mist thinned just enough to reveal a detail that caught Elias's breath in his throat. It was not a monster. It was a boy. The American soldier was young, so terribly young, his helmet sitting slightly askew on his head, heavy and far too large for his frame. His shoulders were hunched against the biting winter chill, his gloved hands gripping his weapon not with fierce aggression, but with a desperate, white-knuckled need for an anchor. For a profound, suspended moment, the war entirely evaporated from Elias's mind. He did not see an enemy empire marching across the snow. He saw a mirror. He saw a boy who was undoubtedly shivering beneath his heavy coat, a boy who probably had a mother praying for him in a warm kitchen on the other side of the world, a boy who was just as terrified of the noise and the dark as Elias was. The American boy paused, taking a slow, heavy step over the shattered trunk of a fallen pine. As he did, he stumbled slightly, catching his balance with a clumsy, heavy-footed step. It was such an ordinary, fragile, human movement. It was the way Elias's younger brother used to stumble when he carried too much flour into the bakery, his small legs struggling under the weight of the heavy sacks. A profound, aching sadness washed over Elias. He gripped the smooth river stone in his pocket, turning it over and over with his thumb. The tragedy of the moment was so vast, so deeply sorrowful, that it felt too heavy to bear. They were all just children, dressed in different shades of heavy wool, pushed into a freezing, broken forest by forces they could not see and men they would never meet. They were shadows in the smoke, caught in the very same nightmare, separated only by a few yards of churned earth and the terrible, invisible lines drawn on a map. Beside him, Thomas watched the approaching figures with deep, sorrowful eyes. The older veteran had seen this tragic play unfold too many times before. He knew the terrible, intimate reality of what was coming, but he also knew that he could not let the young men beside him carry the full weight of that reality just yet. Thomas reached out, his heavy hand resting gently on young Leon's back. Leon was staring wide-eyed at the shifting silhouettes, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Look down, Leon," Thomas whispered, his voice a low, soothing hum that blended perfectly with the quiet rustle of the falling ash. "Just look at the dirt for a moment. Breathe in the cold air. You do not have to watch them until they are close. Just rest your eyes. Leon swallowed hard, nodding slowly. He obeyed the gentle command, lowering his gaze to the damp, dark soil of the trench floor. He focused on a small, perfectly preserved pinecone resting in the mud, a tiny piece of the forest that had somehow survived the falling sky. He traced its delicate, overlapping scales with his eyes, letting the simple geometry of nature calm his racing heart. Thomas was giving the boy a gift, the gift of a few more seconds of peace. By telling him to look away, he was shielding Leon's gentle soul from the overwhelming empathy that was currently tearing at Elias's heart. He was allowing the boy to remain in the quiet, sheltered space of his own mind for just a little while longer. Johannes, standing a few feet away, did not look away. He kept his eyes fixed on the smoke, his hand still resting firmly against his chest, right over the hidden envelope. He watched the American boys moving through the mist, and he found himself wondering if any of them carried letters of their own. Did the boy stumbling over the log have a piece of crumpled paper pressed against his heart? Was he, too, trying to keep the words of a wife or a sweetheart warm in the freezing mist? It is so incredibly easy for history to erase these quiet, shared humanities. The vast, sweeping narratives of the era often blur the faces of the individuals, turning them into nothing more than numbers in a ledger or anonymous shadows in the fog of war. The raw, deeply personal reality of these boys, their shared exhaustion, their mutual fear, their letters and their pocketed stones, is so often lost to time, sanitized by textbooks that prefer the grand stories of strategy and conquest. But if we truly wish to honor them, we must look past the uniforms and pierce the smoke. We must be willing to see their faces, unfiltered and real. Because I believe so deeply in preserving this unvarnished truth, I have put together a special, digital collection hosted on Gumroad. It is an archive of unseen media, raw, uncensored images and profound, unblurred footage of the war that reveals the deeply human, fragile reality of these young men on both sides of the line. It is a way to look them in the eyes and understand the monumental, tragic weight of what they carried. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my greatest hope to share this true, hidden history with you safely. The gray mist continued to swirl, a slow, mesmerizing dance through the broken trees. The silence of the moment was profound, an eerie, heavy quiet that always precedes the breaking of a storm. The artillery was gone, but the quiet that replaced it was not the peaceful, resting silence of the winter lull. It was the breathless, suspended quiet of a world waiting for a heartbeat. The shadows drew closer. Elias could now hear the soft, muffled sound of their gear clinking as they walked, the gentle rattle of a canteen against a canvas belt, the squeak of cold leather boots sinking into the wet ash. These were the exact same sounds that echoed in his own trench every time his friends moved. The symphony of the ordinary soldier is universal. It knows no borders. It speaks only the language of heavy wool, cold steel, and exhausted, rhythmic movement. One of the American soldiers, a tall, thin silhouette on the far left, suddenly paused. He leaned his shoulder against the splintered trunk of a shattered birch tree. He lowered his head, his helmet dipping forward, and he simply stood there for a long moment. Elias watched him, his heart aching with a profound, quiet empathy. Perhaps the boy was simply catching his breath. Perhaps he was whispering a silent prayer into the gray mist. Or perhaps, just like Elias, he was retreating into a quiet sanctuary in his mind, remembering the smell of rain on a familiar street, or the sound of a loved one's voice. In that small, exhausted slump of the American's shoulders, Elias saw the entire tragedy of the forest. They were bound together in this freezing mist, locked in a terrible, intimate dance that none of them had chosen to attend. Johannes slowly exhaled, a long, trembling breath that plumed in the cold air. He shifted his weight, his boots sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the trench mud. He did not raise his rifle. He simply rested his hands on the cold wood of the stock, keeping his fingers loose and calm. He was waiting for the smoke to clear completely, waiting for the shadows to step fully into the morning light. Thomas finally gently tapped Leon on the shoulder. "All right, my boy," he whispered softly, his voice full of a warm, steadying grace. "It is time to look up. It is time to wake up now." Leon slowly raised his head. His eyes were no longer panicked, they were calm, settled by the quiet meditation on the pine cone and the reassuring warmth of Thomas's hand. He looked out into the mist, watching the dark shapes slowly drifting closer through the trees. He did not see monsters either. He simply saw other boys, walking through the ash. The world held its breath. The mist swirled, wrapping the shattered trees and the approaching boys in a soft, gray embrace. There was no anger in the trench. There was no hatred burning in the hearts of the men waiting in the mud. There was only a deep, profound sorrow, a quiet, gentle resilience, and the heartbreaking realization that the shadows and the smoke were just mirrors, reflecting the exact same fears, the exact same hopes, and the exact same fragile humanity back at them through the cold, winter fog. They waited, anchored to each other, as the gray mist finally began to fade. To wear the silver of a leader is not to hold power, but to carry the fragile, beating hearts of 30 other men in your freezing hands. In the pale, ghostly light of the smoking forest, the trenches were no longer lines of defense, they were simply scars in the earth, filled with exhausted boys. The terrible, deafening roar of the falling sky had finally passed, leaving behind a thick, gray fog that clung to the shattered pines. Through this mist, the shadows of the American advance were slowly, cautiously stepping over the broken timber. The world was holding its breath, caught in a suspended, fragile moment between the end of the artillery and the beginning of the unknown. Down in the damp, freezing mud of the trench, a young lieutenant named Lucas knelt quietly against the earthen wall. He was barely older than the boys he commanded, a gentle student who had spent his youth reading poetry in quiet libraries, long before the world had handed him a rifle and a uniform. Pinned to the collar of his heavy, ash-stained greatcoat was a small piece of silver metal. It was the badge of an officer. It weighed less than a single ounce, yet as Lucas looked down the line at the pale, terrified faces of his friends, that tiny piece of silver felt heavier than a mountain. He slowly pulled off his thick woolen glove, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and reached up to touch the cold metal of the badge. It was freezing against his bare fingertips. The men huddled in the dirt were looking at him. They were not looking at him with the crisp, rigid discipline of parade ground soldiers. They were looking at him with the wide, desperate, incredibly vulnerable eyes of children seeking shelter from a storm. They were waiting for him to tell them what to do. They were waiting for him to save them. The weight of that quiet expectation settled deep into Lucas's chest, an agonizing, suffocating pressure that had nothing to do with the freezing air. The orders he had been given by generals sitting in warm, distant rooms miles away were simple: hold the line at all costs. But those generals could not see the forest now. They could not see that the line no longer existed, that the earth had been pulverized into ash, and that the beautiful, protective canopy of the ancient pines was gone. More importantly, the men who drew the maps could not see Johannes. Lucas turned his head slightly, his eyes resting on the quiet woodworker. Johannes was leaning against the trench wall, his hand pressed firmly against his own chest, protecting the hidden letter he had written to his wife, Clara. Lucas knew about that letter. He knew about Clara's garden, and the apple trees Johannes dreamed of seeing in the spring. To give the order to stand and fight in this broken, indefensible place would be to tear that letter to pieces. It would be a betrayal of the beautiful, quiet hope that was keeping Johannes alive. Lucas looked further down the trench, his heart breaking a little more with every face he saw. He saw Elias, the baker's son, clutching a smooth river stone in his hand, his eyes squeezed shut as if he were trying to remember the smell of warm bread. He saw Thomas, the older, gentle veteran, wrapping his own heavy coat around the shivering shoulders of young Leon, shielding the boy from the falling ash with his own body. These were not chess pieces. They were not numbers on a casualty report. They were universes of memory, of love, of quiet, everyday heroism. And Lucas, a boy who had just learned how to shave a few years ago, was entirely responsible for whether those universes continued to exist, or whether they faded into the gray mist forever. He looked out over the parapet, into the swirling smoke. The American shadows were drawing closer, their heavy boots crunching softly in the debris. Lucas did not feel a sudden, burning anger toward them. In the profound, exhausted clarity of the morning, he saw the truth. Leading those shadows was undoubtedly another young boy, wearing a different uniform, but carrying the exact same, agonizing weight of a badge. That American officer was looking back through the mist, feeling the same terrifying responsibility for the boys walking behind him, wishing just as desperately that the forest would simply go back to sleep. It is a terrifying, beautiful, and profoundly lonely thing to be a young leader in the dark. You cannot show your fear. You must swallow your own trembling, hide your own homesickness, and become a hollow vessel to hold the fears of everyone else. Lucas closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the damp earth. He thought of his own father. A quiet, gentle man who had always taught him that true strength was not found in violence, but in the courage it takes to protect the fragile things of the world. Right now, in this shattered trench, the most fragile things in the world were the 30 boys looking at him for guidance. The weight of history is often carried on the narrow shoulders of the very young. They were asked to make impossible choices in the freezing mud, choices that would echo through the lives of families they would never meet. Reconstructing these incredibly delicate, profoundly human moments from the ashes of the past requires sifting through countless forgotten diaries, fading letters, and the quiet, deeply personal memoirs of those who carried the burden. Bringing these hidden stories to light, preserving the fragile humanity that existed in the darkest of times, takes an immense amount of time, delicate research, and care. If you find comfort in these soothing stories, and if you value the gentle preservation of these quiet historical moments, I would be deeply grateful if you considered leaving a small tip in my Ko-Fi jar. Your support allows me to continue exploring the hidden depths of the human heart, to keep reading those fragile letters, and to ensure that the quiet courage of these young men is never forgotten. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for helping me hold the weight of these memories, and for walking this peaceful path with me. Lucas opened his eyes. The gray mist was thinning just enough to let the pale, morning light touch the bottom of the trench. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft, ragged breathing of his men. He made his decision. It was not a decision born of grand military strategy, and it was certainly not the decision the distant generals would have wanted. It was a decision born of pure, unadulterated love. He slowly pushed himself up, keeping his body low below the ruined edge of the trench. He did not draw his weapon. He did not shout a battle cry. He moved softly through the mud, a ghost in the gray light, until he was kneeling right beside Thomas and Leon. He placed his hand gently on Thomas's broad shoulder. The older veteran looked at him, his eyes carrying a lifetime of sorrow, waiting for the inevitable, terrible command. But Lucas just offered a soft, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "We are not staying here," Lucas whispered, his voice so quiet it was barely more than a breath of warm air against the biting chill. "The lion is gone. We are falling back. We are going into the deep trees." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of profound, overwhelming relief washing away the deep lines of tension around his mouth. The veteran understood exactly what the young lieutenant was doing. Lucas was abandoning the arbitrary lines drawn on a map to save the lives of his friends. He was choosing to carry the heavy consequence of disobeying orders so that his men would not have to carry the consequence of the artillery. Thomas nodded slowly, a deep, silent respect passing between the older man and the young boy. It was the purest acknowledgement of true leadership. Lucas moved down the line, a shadow passing from man to man. He touched Elias on the arm, pointing silently toward the dense, unbroken timber far behind them. He knelt beside Johannes, placing a hand over the pocket where the letter to Clara rested, and gave a firm, reassuring nod. Quietly, Lucas whispered to the men, his voice a soothing, steady current in the freezing air. "Do not run. Just melt into the mist. I will be right behind you. Just keep moving until you cannot smell the ash anymore." The transformation in the trench was immediate and beautiful. The suffocating, paralyzing terror that had held the boys in a vice grip simply evaporated. They were no longer trapped in a grave of freezing mud. They had a purpose, a direction, and a guardian who was watching over them. With slow, careful movements, the boys began to stand. They did not make a sound. They were like a herd of gentle deer slipping away into the winter fog. They kept their heads low, their heavy coats brushing softly against the damp earth, moving with a quiet, desperate grace. Thomas guided Leon by the shoulder, leading the young boy out of the trench and into the protective cover of the remaining trees. Johannes followed, his hand never leaving his chest, carrying his hope safely away from the breaking storm. Elias was next, his fingers still tracing the smooth river stone, walking toward the promise of a tomorrow he had almost given up on. Lucas was the last to leave. He stood alone in the empty, ruined trench, the gray ash falling softly on his shoulders. He looked back over the parapet one last time. The shadows of the American boys were still advancing, stepping carefully through the debris, entirely unaware that the trench they were approaching was now empty. Lucas felt a strange, profound sense of peace. The badge on his collar no longer felt heavy. It felt right. He had not won a battle, and he had not held a line. But as he watched the backs of his friends disappearing safely into the deep, quiet woods, he knew he had done something far more important. He had kept the universes breathing. He had kept the letters safe. He turned his back to the smoke, pulling his heavy collar up against the chill, and began to walk softly into the trees, following the quiet footsteps of his brothers, leaving the war behind in the mist. To disappear entirely into the earth is the quietest, most desperate prayer a soldier can ever make. When Lieutenant Lucas led his men away from the shattered trench and into the deep, unbroken timber, they did not march. They melted. They became shadows slipping through the pale, gray mist, moving with the slow, reverent caution of ghosts who do not wish to disturb the living world. They walked until the bitter, acrid smell of the artillery smoke began to fade, replaced by the ancient, comforting perfume of untouched pine, damp loam, and freezing winter moss. Here, in the heart of the old forest, the trees had not been touched by the steel rain. Their massive, dark trunks stood like pillars in a quiet cathedral, and their heavy branches, thick with snow, draped low to the ground, creating natural, hidden sanctuaries in the gloom. It was into one of these natural hollows, a shallow depression at the base of a giant oak, that Lucas guided his exhausted boys. "Down," he whispered, his voice barely a ripple in the freezing air. "Press yourselves into the dirt. Become the roots. Do not move. Do not make a sound." The boys obeyed without hesitation. They did not just lie down, they offered themselves completely to the earth. They pressed their chests flat against the freezing moss, pulling their heavy woolen collars high over their necks, tucking their faces into the crooks of their arms. They became a part of the forest floor, a tangle of gray coats, dark mud, and quiet, terrified breath. To lie in the dirt while the world searches for you is to experience time in its slowest, most agonizing form. Every second stretches into an eternity. The cold of the damp earth begins to seep through the thick layers of wool, finding the skin, wrapping its icy fingers around the bones. But for these men, that biting cold was a blessing. It meant they were hidden. It meant the earth was holding them close, hiding them from the terrible, mechanical storm that had consumed the trench they had just left behind. Johannes, the gentle woodworker, lay with his cheek pressed directly against the dark, fragrant soil. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. Beneath the faint, lingering scent of winter frost, he smelled the deep, rich life of the earth. It smelled like the soil of his own garden back home, the very same dirt he and his wife, Clara, turned over every spring. As he lay there, trembling slightly from the cold, he placed his hand over his coat, feeling the folded letter resting safely against his heart. He began to weave a quiet, protective thought. He imagined that the earth beneath him was connected to the earth in his garden, a single, continuous blanket of soil stretching across continents and countries. He imagined that if he whispered his love into the dirt right here, the roots would carry it all the way home to Clara. It was a beautiful, childish thought, but in the freezing dark of the woods, it was a lifeline. It kept his mind tethered to love, rather than surrendering to the paralyzing fear of the boots moving through the mist behind them. And the boots were moving. Through the dense, foggy timber, the sound drifted toward them like a slow-moving tide. It was the soft, rhythmic crunch of snow and snapping twigs. The American soldiers, having found the front trenches empty and abandoned, were pushing deeper into the woods, searching for the shadows that had slipped away. The sound of an approaching enemy in the quiet woods is not dramatic. It does not come with sweeping music or dramatic shouts. It comes as a gentle rustle of fabric, the faint, metallic clink of a canteen against a belt buckle, the heavy, exhausted sigh of a young man pushing his way through the deep drifts. Thomas, the veteran, lay beside young Leon. The boy was trembling so violently that Thomas could feel the vibration through the frozen ground. Thomas did not dare to speak. A voice, even a whisper, might carry through the still, winter air. Instead, he used his hands. He reached out and began to gather the fallen, dry pine needles and loose, damp leaves that littered the forest floor. With incredibly slow, deliberate movements, he sprinkled the debris over Leon's gray coat, breaking up the silhouette of the boy's shoulders. He was camouflaging him, hiding him in plain sight, with the gentle, meticulous care of a father tucking a blanket around a sleeping child. When he was finished, Thomas rested his large, heavy hand squarely on the center of Leon's back. He applied a steady, grounding pressure. It was a physical translation of the words he could not say. I am here. You are anchored. You are safe. Leon closed his eyes tight, focusing entirely on the warm, heavy weight of Thomas's hand. He slowed his breathing, matching the rhythm of his inhalations to the slow, steady beating of his own heart. He imagined himself turning into stone, cold and unfeeling, just another rock resting at the base of the great oak tree. Elias lay just a few feet away, his face turned toward the advancing sound. Through the tangled, low-hanging branches of their hiding place, he could see the pale mist shifting. And then, he saw them. The American soldiers were passing by, no more than 30 yards away. They were walking in a loose, staggered line, their rifles held carefully across their chests. They looked exhausted. Their faces were smeared with the same dark ash that covered Elias. They moved with a slow, heavy-footed caution, their eyes scanning the thick timber, searching for a fight they clearly did not want to find. Elias held his breath. He pressed the smooth river stone in his pocket so hard his knuckles turned white beneath his gloves. If one of those boys turned their head just a fraction to the left, if the mist thinned for just a single second, it would all be over. The fragile, beautiful peace they had found in the dirt would be shattered in an instant. He watched a young American soldier stop near a birch tree. The boy reached up, pushing his heavy helmet back, and wiped a gloved hand across his sweating forehead. For a breathless, suspended moment, the American boy looked directly toward the dark tangle of roots where Elias and his friends lay hidden. Elias did not blink. He did not breathe. He felt his soul suspend itself in the freezing air. He saw the weariness in the American's eyes, the deep, hollow exhaustion of a child who has seen too much and walked too far. In that quiet, agonizing second, there was no hatred. There was only a profound, silent plea passed between the hidden and the seeker. Please, just keep walking. Please, let us both survive this morning. It is these raw, agonizingly quiet moments of survival that truly define the human experience of this era. It is not the grand charges or the roaring artillery that reveal the depths of a man's soul, but the silent, desperate prayers whispered into the dirt, and the gentle, protective hand of a friend in the dark. So much of our recorded history glosses over these deeply intimate, terrifying minutes of hiding and holding breath. The sanitized versions of the past do not show us the trembling hands, or the boys begging the earth to swallow them whole. Because I believe that true history is found in these unvarnished, vulnerable truths, I have dedicated myself to uncovering them. I want to invite you to join our Patreon community, a dedicated space for uncensored history. There, we share free podcasts that dive deeply into these exact, raw realities of the era, exploring the intimate stories that textbooks often leave behind. You will also find unrestricted, raw video sections that show the unblurred truth of the front lines, and it serves as a tip jar that makes this massive, delicate research possible. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for helping me bring these quiet whispers out of the dirt and into the light. The American boy by the birch tree slowly lowered his hand. He adjusted his helmet, letting it fall back over his eyes, and turned his face forward. With a heavy sigh that Elias could hear across the frozen space, the boy took a step, rejoining the slow, quiet march of his unit. They walked past. The sound of their heavy boots crunching in the snow slowly began to fade, moving deeper into the woods, drifting further and further away from the hidden hollow at the base of the oak. Elias did not move immediately. None of them did. They remained pressed into the earth, their bodies locked in the rigid, agonizing tension of survival. They waited until the sound of the boots was completely swallowed by the vast, echoing silence of the winter forest. They waited until the gray mist settled, wrapping the trees in a soft, undisturbed embrace. Only then did Lieutenant Lucas, lying at the edge of the hollow, let out a long, slow breath. It was a breath that carried the weight of the entire morning. He had made the most difficult choice of his young life. He had abandoned his post, defied the invisible generals, and led his men into the unknown. But as he looked back at the tangle of gray coats blending perfectly into the forest floor, he saw the beautiful, undeniable proof that his choice was right. They were alive. Every single one of them. Lucas slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. The freezing mud clung to his coat and his face. He looked at Thomas, offering a single, slow nod. Thomas removed his heavy hand from Leon's back. He gently patted the boy's shoulder. "They are gone, little one," Thomas whispered, his voice a warm, rumbling comfort. "You can breathe now. You did perfectly. You were a stone." Leon let out a shuddering gasp, his small frame going completely limp as the terror finally released its grip. He turned his face out of the dirt, looking up at Thomas with eyes full of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had survived the storm, not by fighting it, but by hiding in the protective shadow of a friend. Johannes slowly sat up, brushing the damp leaves and pine needles from his chest. He reached inside his coat, his fingers trembling, and gently touched the envelope. It was still there. It was still safe. The beautiful words he had written to Clara had survived the artillery, they had survived the retreat, and they had survived the terrifying, quiet approach of the shadows and the mist. He closed his eyes, offering a silent, deeply tearful prayer of thanks to the dark soil that had hidden them. Elias rolled onto his back, looking up through the thick, snowy branches of the oak tree. The pale, morning sky was beginning to peek through the canopy, casting soft, delicate rays of light down into the gloom. The air smelled clean again, the bitter scent of the war finally washing away on the winter breeze. He pulled his hand out of his pocket, looking at the smooth river stone resting in his dirty, freezing palm. It was just a rock. But in that moment, it felt like the most precious object in the world. It was a piece of the earth that he could carry with him, a quiet reminder of the deep, hidden strength they had all found while lying in the dirt. They did not speak. They did not celebrate. The exhaustion they felt was too deep, too absolute for words. They simply sat together in the damp, freezing hollow, their shoulders touching, their breath pluming softly in the morning light. They were dirty, freezing, and entirely alone in a vast, broken forest. But as they looked at one another, their faces smeared with mud and ash, they saw something incredibly beautiful. They saw the quiet, unbroken resilience of the human heart. The world had tried to tear them apart with fire and noise, but they had found sanctuary in the quietest, most humble place of all. They had found peace in the whispers of the dirt, wrapped in the gentle, unyielding love of brotherhood, waiting patiently for the violent storm to simply pass them by. When the storm finally moves on, it leaves behind a quiet that is heavier than any thunder. For a long time, the only sound in the deep, ancient timber was the slow, rhythmic falling of the winter snow. The heavy boots of the American patrols had faded into a distant, muffled memory, swallowed entirely by the vast, gray mist of the forest. The terrible, mechanical roaring that had torn the morning apart was gone, replaced by a profound, suspended stillness. The world, it seemed, had simply run out of breath. Down in the shallow hollow beneath the roots of the giant oak, the boys remained pressed against the earth. They were perfectly still, their gray coats dusted with fallen pine needles and damp earth, blending so seamlessly into the forest floor that they looked like nothing more than fallen logs. They had become a part of the quiet, holding their breath long after the danger had walked away, terrified that even a single sigh might call the violent storm back. But the storm did not return. Slowly, the adrenaline that had held their muscles in a vice grip began to recede. It faded like the dying embers of a fire, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion that settled into their very bones. Lieutenant Lucas was the first to move. He did not stand up, for the canopy was still too open, the world still too raw. He merely lifted his head, his pale face smeared with dark mud and pale ash. He listened. He closed his eyes and let his senses reach out through the freezing, misty air. He heard the gentle creak of a pine branch swaying under the weight of the new snow. He heard the tiny, delicate sound of a single drop of melted frost falling onto a dry leaf. But he did not hear the metallic clink of weapons. He did not hear the crunch of heavy boots. He slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows and looked back at the tangle of boys hidden in the roots. He offered a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was the quietest, most beautiful command he had ever given. "We are safe. You can come back to the world now." The unclenching of their bodies was a slow, agonizing process. When you have made yourself as small as possible, expanding back into your own skin feels strange and vulnerable. Thomas, the older, gentle veteran, was the first to shift his weight. He slowly rolled off his side, his heavy joints popping in the cold air. He did not immediately check his own weapon or brush the dirt from his own face. Instead, his eyes instantly sought out young Leon. The boy was still curled into a tight, trembling ball, his face buried deep in the collar of his coat. Thomas reached out with his large, calloused hand and gently rested it on the back of Leon's head. He stroked the boy's damp, ash-covered hair with a slow, rhythmic tenderness. "They are gone, Leon," Thomas whispered, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that carried all the warmth of a hearth fire. "The woods are empty. You did so beautifully, my boy. You can open your eyes now." Leon took a sudden, sharp breath, like a swimmer finally breaking the surface of the water. He uncurled his small, shivering frame and looked up at Thomas. The boy's eyes were wide and swimming with unshed tears, reflecting the pale, ghostly light of the winter morning. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and gripped the sleeve of Thomas's heavy greatcoat, holding onto the rough wool as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. Thomas let him hold it, offering a soft, reassuring smile that spoke of 1,000 shared survivals. A few feet away, Elias slowly sat up, his back resting against the rough, freezing bark of the oak tree. His hands were numb, his fingers stiff and aching from the biting cold of the damp soil. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, smooth river stone. He held it in his palm, letting his eyes trace the familiar, rounded curves. Just an hour ago, while the sky was falling, that stone had been his anchor to the world. Now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt like a miracle. He rubbed his thumb over its surface, realizing with a profound, quiet awe that he was still here to feel it. He was still breathing. The embers of the morning's terror were slowly fading, replaced by the simple, beautiful warmth of being alive. He closed his eyes and let a long, shuddering sigh escape his lips, releasing the fear back into the earth that had hidden him. Johannes, the woodworker, remained on his knees in the moss. He had his heavy coat unbuttoned, his bare hand pressed firmly against his chest. Beneath his freezing fingers, the envelope containing his letter to Clara was damp with his own sweat, but it was perfectly intact. He traced the outline of the paper through the thin fabric of his tunic. The words he had written in the dark dugout, the promises of apple blossoms and warm cobblestone streets, had survived the fire. He looked around the small hollow at the faces of his friends. They were haggard, dirty, and profoundly exhausted. But as Johannes looked at Elias holding his stone, and Thomas comforting Leon, and Lucas watching over them all with gentle, tired eyes, he realized that the greatest heroism of the morning had not been fought with steel. It had been fought with quiet resilience. It had been the simple, stubborn refusal to let go of each other in the dark. Thomas reached down to his canvas belt and unclipped his metal canteen. The water inside was freezing, almost turning to slush, but to men who had just survived the end of the world, it was the sweetest nectar imaginable. Thomas uncapped it and handed it first to Leon. "Just a sip, little one," Thomas murmured softly. "Let it wash the dust away." Leon took the canteen with trembling hands, raising the cold metal to his lips. He drank slowly, the freezing water soothing his parched, ash-coated throat. He passed it back to Thomas, who then handed it across the hollow to Elias. There was a profound, silent communion in the passing of that simple tin flask. As Elias drank, and then passed it to Johannes, they were not just sharing water. They were sharing the deep, unspoken bond of those who have looked into the abyss and walked away together. They were confirming, with every gentle passing of the canteen, that they were still a family. They were still whole. It is in these incredibly quiet, unseen moments of the aftermath that the true story of the era was written. The grand history books will tell you about the artillery barrages, the shifting of the front lines, and the grand strategies of the unseen generals. But they so rarely tell you about the passing of a freezing canteen in a hidden hollow, or the way a veteran strokes the hair of a terrified boy. So much of what truly happened in this monumental conflict was not loudly proclaimed on the battlefields, but hidden in the quiet shadows, carried out by unseen hands and unspoken courage. If you find a deep, resonant comfort in exploring these hidden layers of the past, and if you are drawn to the quiet secrets that shaped the world while the guns were firing, I have something very special I would love to share with you. I write a weekly email newsletter where we take deep, relaxing dives into the forgotten, shadowy corners of history. When you join our quiet community, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a gentle journey into the invisible heroism, the secret communications, and the unseen hands that moved the world in the dark. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my gift to you, to help you safely explore the hidden depths of the past. As the morning slowly wore on, the mist in the forest began to thin, lifting toward the canopy like a beautiful, gray veil. The pale winter sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, delicate beams of golden light down through the branches. The light touched the damp earth of the hollow, illuminating the faces of the resting boys. They did not speak much. There was no need for words. The fading embers of the attack had left them in a state of quiet, peaceful shock. They sat together, leaning against the roots and each other, simply watching the light play across the snow. Elias watched a single, tiny snowflake drift down from the canopy above. It danced in the golden light, spinning slowly, before coming to rest gently on the sleeve of Johannes's coat. The world was beginning to cover its scars. The forest, ancient and deeply forgiving, was already starting the quiet work of burying the morning's violence under a fresh, pure blanket of white. Lucas sat a little way apart from the others, his back resting against a slender birch tree. He watched his men with a heart full of profound, aching love. He had made the choice to lead them away from the line, to abandon their orders, and to sink into the earth. It was a choice that could cost him everything if the distant generals ever found out. But as he looked at Leon, whose trembling had finally stopped, and at Johannes, whose hand still rested gently over his heart, Lucas knew he would make the exact same choice 1,000 times over. The badge on his collar was tarnished with ash, but his conscience was perfectly clear. He had protected the universes entrusted to him. He had kept the fragile flames of their humanity burning through the darkest part of the storm. "We will rest here until the sun touches the tops of the pines," Lucas whispered softly, his voice drifting across the small space like a gentle breeze. "Then, we will move deeper into the timber. We will find a safe place for the night." The men nodded slowly. They trusted him implicitly. He was no longer just their lieutenant, he was their shepherd. He had guided them through the valley of shadows, and they would follow him wherever the quiet forest led. Thomas shifted his weight, pulling his heavy greatcoat tighter around himself. He leaned his head back against the oak, closing his tired eyes. He pictured his home, the silver birches he had spoken of in the dark dugout. He imagined the snow falling peacefully there, untouched by ash or fire. He let that gentle image wrap around his exhausted mind, a soft, woolen blanket for his soul. Johannes, too, closed his eyes. He let his hand fall from his chest, confident now that his letter to Clara was safe. He thought of the apple trees in their garden, waiting patiently beneath the frost for the promise of spring. He knew the winter would be long, and he knew the war was far from over. But today, the embers had faded. Today, the earth had hidden them, and the sky had spared them. The forest wrapped them in its quiet, dark embrace. The soft crunch of the snow settling, the gentle whisper of the wind in the high branches, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the boys sitting in the dirt became a new, beautiful lullaby. The terror of the morning was now just a memory, a fading echo pushed away by the overwhelming, quiet grace of simply being alive. They rested in the hollow, letting the golden light warm their frozen faces, anchored safely to each other in the beautiful, deeply profound silence of the winter woods. When the fire finally dies, the ashes it leaves behind tell the truest, quietest story of what was burned. In the deep, ancient hollow beneath the roots of the great oak, the world had finally stopped trembling. The terrible, mechanical roaring of the morning had been replaced by a silence so vast and profound it felt almost holy. The pale winter sun had finally broken through the high, shattered canopy, sending long, delicate shafts of golden light down into the damp gloom of the forest floor. The light caught the dust suspended in the air, thousands of tiny, glittering motes drifting lazily in the freezing breeze. But as the light touched the faces of the boys hidden in the earth, it revealed a profound and silent transformation. They were no longer the fresh-faced youths who had marveled at the quiet snow just a few hours ago. They were covered, from the heavy wool of their helmets to the tips of their frozen boots, in a fine, powdery layer of gray ash. It was not just the dirt of the trench. This ash was the pulverized memory of the forest itself. It was the shattered bark of ancient pines, the scorched earth, and the bitter, lingering ghost of the artillery fire. It had drifted down upon them while they lay pressed into the moss, coating them in a uniform, ghostly gray. They looked like statues carved from the very earth they had prayed to, monuments to a quiet, desperate endurance. Elias, the young baker's son, slowly turned his head to look at the man lying next to him. It was Johannes. The gentle woodworker was sitting up now, his back resting against the rough bark of the oak tree. Johannes had his eyes closed, his breathing slow and shallow, his hand still resting protectively over the pocket that held his letter to his wife, Clara. As Elias watched him, a deep, aching sorrow swelled in his chest. The ash had settled into the deep creases around Johannes's eyes and mouth, drawing lines of profound exhaustion that had not been there the day before. The war had taken a brush of soot and painted the face of an old man onto the canvas of a young one. The gray dust clung to Johannes's eyelashes, making them look thick and heavy. Elias reached out with a trembling, gloved hand. He didn't speak. The air felt too fragile for words. He simply extended his fingers and gently brushed a dusting of ash from the shoulder of Johannes's greatcoat. Johannes opened his eyes. They were stark and bright against the dark soot covering his cheeks. He looked at Elias, and in that silent gaze, 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. There was no need to describe the terror of the falling sky, or the paralyzing fear of the American shadows passing just yards away in the mist. It was all there, written plainly in the ash on their faces. Johannes offered a slow, incredibly tired smile. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking expression, a small, defiant spark of humanity shining through a mask of gray sorrow. Across the hollow, Thomas, the older veteran, was slowly sitting up. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stiffness, his joints aching from the prolonged, freezing damp of the earth. His face, usually so warm and full of quiet authority, was completely obscured by the pale dust. He looked like a ghost of the winter woods. But Thomas did not focus on his own exhaustion. As always, his first thought was for the boy beside him. Young Leon was sitting with his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs. The boy was staring blankly into the trees, his mind still caught somewhere in the echoing thunder of the morning. His youth, which usually shone so brightly even in the darkest dugouts, was completely buried beneath the heavy soot. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, frayed square of cloth. It was a handkerchief he had carried for months, worn soft by time. He reached over and gently placed his large hand under Leon's chin, turning the boy's face toward the light. Leon blinked, his wide, frightened eyes focusing on the older man. "Let us find you again, my boy," Thomas whispered, his voice a low, soothing hum that blended perfectly with the rustle of the wind. With incredibly slow, tender movements, Thomas began to wipe the ash from Leon's face. He wiped the soot from the boy's forehead, revealing the pale, frightened skin beneath. He gently brushed the cloth over Leon's cheeks, wiping away the bitter residue of the artillery. With every stroke, it was as if Thomas was slowly pulling the boy back from the edge of the nightmare, peeling away the mask of the war and revealing the gentle, fragile child beneath. When Thomas finished, Leon took a deep, shuddering breath. The ash was gone from his skin, but the dark, heavy shadows beneath his eyes remained. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Thomas's broad, soot-covered shoulder. He didn't cry. He was too exhausted for tears. He simply rested, anchored to the world by the quiet, fatherly love of the man holding him. Lieutenant Lucas watched them from the edge of the hollow. The young officer sat perfectly still, letting the golden sunlight warm his frozen limbs. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over. They were completely black, stained with the soil and the ash of the forest floor. He reached up and touched the collar of his coat, finding the small silver badge of his rank. It was dull now, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. Lucas rubbed his thumb over the silver, cleaning it slowly. As the bright metal gleamed once more in the sun, he felt the immense, suffocating weight of the morning press down upon him. He had looked at the faces of his men, and he had seen the terrible cost of survival. They were alive, yes. Their hearts were still beating, and their lungs were still drawing in the crisp winter air. But a part of them had been burned away in the fire, leaving only these quiet, ashen ghosts behind. To look upon the faces of history is a profound and deeply moving experience. When we close our eyes and imagine these quiet moments in the woods, we try to see them clearly. We try to picture the soot on their cheeks, the exhaustion in their eyes, and the small, desperate acts of kindness that kept them alive. We yearn for a physical connection to that reality, a way to touch the era and truly understand the magnitude of what ordinary men endured. For those who feel this deep pull toward the past, there is a beautiful comfort in holding the tangible remnants of history or immersing yourself in the visual stories of those who lived it. Many find a profound connection by exploring authentic WWII memorabilia, finding small, physical anchors to that time. Others find it in masterfully crafted cinema, such as the movie Midway, which you can find on Amazon Prime. Though it tells the story of a different ocean and a different battle, it captures the exact same, universal truth, the faces of young men, forever changed by the sudden, overwhelming fires of war. It is a powerful way to honor this shared human experience. I have gathered some wonderful resources and collections on Amazon for you to explore. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my deepest wish that you can explore this history safely and gently. In the quiet of the forest hollow, the ritual of cleaning continued. It was a silent, solemn undertaking. There was no rushing water to wash away the stains of the morning, so the men turned to the forest itself. Elias reached out and scooped up a small handful of pure, untouched snow from the base of a nearby pine tree. It was dazzlingly white, a stark, beautiful contrast to the gray world around them. He pressed the freezing snow to his face. The sudden, biting shock of the cold was a revelation. It stung his cheeks, but it also woke him up. It reminded him that he was flesh and blood, not just a statue of dust. He rubbed the melting snow over his eyes, feeling the gritty ash wash away, trickling down his chin in dark, muddy drops. When he opened his eyes again, the colors of the forest seemed infinitely brighter. The deep green of the pine needles, the rich brown of the oak bark, the pale blue of the winter sky, it all rushed back into his vision with a startling, beautiful clarity. Johannes did the same, using the snow to clean his hands before he dared to reach inside his coat again. He wanted his fingers to be perfectly clean when he touched the envelope. He wanted to make sure that the ash of the war did not stain the beautiful words he had written to Clara. He washed his hands with the freezing snow until his skin was raw and pink, a quiet, desperate act of preservation. They sat together in a loose circle, their faces clean but carrying a profound, quiet gravity. The mask of ash was gone, but the shadows it had cast remained. They looked at each other with a new, deeply reverent understanding. They had all been pushed to the very edge of the earth. They had listened to the sky tear itself apart, and they had felt the ground tremble beneath their bodies. They had hidden in the dirt like frightened animals, praying to be forgotten by the world. And yet, here they were. They had not abandoned each other. When the dark had been absolute, Thomas had held Leon. When the fear had been paralyzing, Elias had reached for Johannes. When the orders had demanded senseless sacrifice, Lucas had chosen the lives of his boys. The ash had tried to turn them into ghosts, but their quiet, stubborn love had kept them entirely human. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his river stone once more. He held it out into the sunlight, letting the golden rays warm the smooth surface. He looked at Johannes, and then at Thomas, and finally at young Leon. He didn't say a word, but he held the stone out, a silent, humble offering. Johannes reached over and placed his hand over Elias's. Then Thomas added his heavy hand to the pile. And finally, slowly, Leon reached out and rested his small, pale hand on top of theirs. They sat there for a long time, bathed in the quiet, golden light of the winter afternoon. For hands, washed clean by the snow, resting together over a simple, smooth stone. It was a fragile, beautiful monument to their survival. The forest around them was deeply still. The birds had not yet returned, and the wind had died away to a gentle, whispering breath. The embers of the morning's terror had finally grown cold. The war was still out there, somewhere beyond the trees, waiting for them in the snow. But for this one, perfect, suspended moment, they were just boys sitting in a sunlit hollow. They were breathing. They were together. And as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that whatever fires lay ahead, they would never have to face the ashes alone. It was not the sound of boots or the roar of steel that finally woke the forest, but the slow, mournful exhale of a cold winter wind. For a long time after the American patrol had slipped away into the mist, the air had remained perfectly still. The gray ash and the pale fog had hung over the hollow like a heavy curtain, wrapping the surviving boys in a thick, suspended silence. But nature, in her infinite and indifferent wisdom, does not allow a landscape to hold its breath forever. Deep in the north, over the unseen mountains and across the frozen valleys, a subtle shift in the air pressure gave birth to a new, invisible current. It began as a mere whisper in the highest, unbroken branches of the ancient pines. A soft, rushing sound that traveled through the canopy like a beautiful, sweeping sigh. And then, it descended. The cold wind swept down into the hollow, touching the damp earth and brushing against the huddled, exhausted forms of the young men. It was not a violent gale, but a steady, piercing breeze. It carried with it the sharp, unmistakable scent of deep winter, the smell of pure frost, frozen sap, and the vast, icy emptiness of the world beyond the trees. As the wind moved through the hollow, it acted as a gentle, invisible hand, clearing away the lingering ghosts of the morning. It caught the edges of the thick, gray mist, swirling it into delicate ribbons before pushing it away, carrying the acrid, bitter smell of the artillery smoke off into the distance. For Elias, sitting against the rough bark of the oak tree, the wind felt like a sudden plunge into freezing water. The adrenaline that had kept his blood rushing and his heart pounding had completely burned away, leaving his body completely hollow. The damp wool of his greatcoat, which had protected him while he lay pressed into the dirt, now felt like a heavy, icy shroud. The wind slipped past the frayed edges of his collar, trailing its freezing fingers across his newly washed neck. He shivered, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in his chest and radiated out to his numb fingertips. But Elias did not curse the wind. He welcomed it. The biting cold was incredibly, undeniably real. It was a sharp, physical tether that pulled him entirely out of the numb shock of survival and placed him firmly back into his own body. The wind was telling him that he was alive. It was whispering against his cheek, reminding him that the fire was gone, but the winter remained. He slowly turned his head, watching the wind play with the landscape. The clearing mist revealed the true, heartbreaking extent of the forest's scars. The trees that had once stood as a dense, protective wall were now jagged and broken, their pale, splintered wood exposed to the elements. But even in this ruin, the wind found a strange, tragic beauty. It caught the loose, pulverized bark and sent it dancing across the snowdrifts. It gently rocked the hanging, broken branches, making them creak with a slow, rhythmic wooden melody. Across the hollow, Thomas was helping young Leon to his feet. The boy was stiff, his young limbs locked by the cold and the long hours spent huddled in the dirt. Thomas stood behind him, wrapping his large arms around Leon's shoulders, rubbing the boy's arms to generate a meager, fleeting friction. "Breathe it in, Leon," Thomas whispered softly, his voice carrying clearly on the crisp, moving air. "Taste the wind. It is clean. The smoke is gone. It is just the winter now." Leon closed his eyes and tipped his chin up toward the pale, shifting canopy. He took a long, deep breath. The freezing air rushed into his lungs, shocking and pure. It tasted of nothing but snow and distance. He let out a long, trembling sigh, watching his breath form a beautiful, white cloud that was instantly caught and carried away by the breeze. For the first time since the sky had fallen, a tiny, genuine spark of life returned to the boy's eyes. Lieutenant Lucas stood at the edge of their small sanctuary, looking out into the deep, unbroken timber that lay ahead of them. His silver badge, wiped clean of the ash, caught the faint, golden light of the afternoon sun. He watched the wind move through the pines, reading the forest like an ancient map. He knew they could not stay in the hollow. The cold was a different kind of enemy, quieter than the artillery, but just as absolute. If they remained sitting in the damp earth, the winter wind would slowly lull them into a sleep from which they would never wake. "We must walk," Lucas murmured, his voice gentle but carrying a quiet, unbreakable authority. "The wind is clearing our path. We must keep the blood moving. We will go deeper, where the trees are thick enough to break the chill." Johannes slowly pushed himself up from the ground. He swayed for a moment, his boots slipping slightly on the frozen moss. He reached up and clutched the lapels of his heavy coat, pulling them tightly together across his chest. Beneath the wool, he could feel the faint, crinkling sound of the envelope. The cold wind seemed to search for it, trying to steal the fragile warmth of the paper. Johannes bowed his head against the breeze, weaving a quiet thought in his mind to keep himself moving. He imagined that this exact same wind was blowing across the garden in his village, rattling the bare branches of his apple trees, blowing against the windows of his home where Clara was waiting. It was a beautiful, melancholic thought, that the air touching his frozen face right now would eventually travel across the world to touch hers. It made the bitter cold feel a little less lonely. As the boys gathered their heavy rifles, using them as walking sticks to support their aching legs, they formed a loose, quiet line behind their lieutenant. They stepped out of the hollow and into the path of the wind. When the wind clears the smoke of the battlefield, it leaves behind a landscape stripped of all its illusions. The sanitized, heroic narratives that we so often read in history books are much like that gray mist. They soften the edges, they blur the heartbreaking reality, and they hide the raw, unvarnished truth of what these boys actually endured. When the mist is blown away, what remains is deeply human, undeniably fragile, and profoundly moving. I believe that to truly understand the depth of their resilience, we must be willing to look at that clear, unclouded reality. We must be willing to see the history without the softening filter of time. Because this raw truth is so important, I have created a digital collection hosted on Gumroad, dedicated to uncovering the unseen media of the war. It is an archive of raw, unedited images and restricted videos that capture the harsh, uncensored realities of the conflict, the kind of profound, unfiltered history that is rarely shown on regular platforms. It is a way to look past the textbooks and see the true, human face of the era. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my sincere hope that this collection helps you connect with their hidden stories in a deeply meaningful way. The boys began their slow march deeper into the ancient timber. They did not speak. The wind was their only companion, a constant, rushing presence that filled their ears and numbed their cheeks. It whipped the loose tails of their greatcoats around their knees and sent tiny, stinging crystals of surface snow dancing across their path. Every step was an act of quiet, agonizing heroism. Their boots were heavy, encrusted with frozen mud and ash. Their muscles screamed for rest. But they kept their heads bowed, following the slow, steady footsteps of the man in front of them. Elias watched the back of Johannes's coat, focusing entirely on the rhythmic sway of the gray wool. Thomas walked right behind Leon, his hand occasionally reaching out to gently steady the boy when he stumbled over a hidden root. In the face of the biting wind, they became a single, moving organism, bound together by a shared, desperate need to survive the afternoon. The cold stripped away everything that was not essential. There was no room left for fear of the future, or regret for the past. There was only the right foot, then the left foot, and the sharp, burning intake of the winter air. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their massive, snow-laden branches intertwining to form a dense, natural roof. The wind lost its sharpest edge here, broken by the heavy timber, becoming a low, echoing moan in the distance. The pale sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, deeply blue shadows across the snow. The light in the forest turned to a soft, melancholic lavender. It was the twilight of the winter, the quietest, most peaceful hour of the day. Elias let his eyes wander through the darkening trees. The beauty of the undisturbed forest was breathtaking. The snow here was perfectly pure, glittering like a sea of crushed diamonds in the fading light. The world felt ancient, indifferent to the temporary struggles of the men walking through it. The trees had stood through countless winters, and they would stand through countless more, long after the war had faded into a distant memory. He felt a strange, profound sense of comfort in that permanence. The artillery had tried to destroy the world, but it had only managed to scar a tiny piece of it. The wind, the snow, the deep earth, they were all still here. And miraculously, so was he. Johannes pulled his collar up higher, his breath warming the freezing wool. He was tired. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that made his eyelids heavy and his mind drift. But the cold wind had done its job. It had kept him awake. It had carried them away from the Valley of Shadows and into this quiet, deepening sanctuary. Lieutenant Lucas finally raised his hand, a slow, gentle gesture calling for a halt. They had found a small, natural ravine, shielded on three sides by high banks of earth and thick clusters of evergreen bushes. It was out of the wind, hidden from the world, and blanketed in soft, dry pine needles. Here, Lucas whispered, his breath a white cloud in the twilight. We will rest here. The wind cannot find us in this place. The boys simply collapsed. They did not bother to unroll their blankets or clear the ground. They just sank into the soft pine needles, curling their heavy bodies together to share their meager warmth. Thomas immediately pulled Leon against his side, wrapping his large coat over the boy's trembling shoulders. Johannes lay on his side, his knees pulled to his chest, his hand resting in its familiar, protective place over his heart. Elias lay on his back, looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible through the heavy branches. The lavender light was fading into a deep, bruised purple. The first, faint stars were just beginning to prick through the cold atmosphere. He listened. The wind was still singing high above them, a mournful, continuous lullaby in the canopy. It sounded beautiful now. It was no longer a harsh, biting enemy, but a powerful, invisible guardian, sweeping the forest clean, erasing their tracks in the snow, and wrapping their quiet, hidden ravine in a profound, protective isolation. The breath of the cold wind had awakened them from the nightmare, pushed them through the pain, and finally delivered them into the peaceful, waiting arms of the winter night. They closed their eyes, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of their own breathing match the gentle swing of the trees, anchored safely together in the beautiful, freezing dark. There is a profound, aching difference between the silence that precedes a storm and the deeply bruised silence that follows it. If you were to stand at the edge of the hidden ravine as the winter night finally claimed the forest, you would hear an absolute, breathtaking stillness. The rushing, mournful wind that had guided the boys through the timber had slowly died away with the setting sun, leaving behind a world wrapped in velvet shadows and freezing, motionless air. Above them, the narrow ribbon of sky visible through the heavy canopy transitioned from a bruised, melancholic lavender into a deep, endless indigo. The stars began to emerge, not as distant suns, but as tiny, fractured pieces of ice scattered across the dark, watching over the sleeping earth with a cold, indifferent beauty. Down in the bed of soft, dry pine needles, the surviving men lay tangled together, a single, breathing island of warmth in a vast ocean of frost. The silence that rested over them now was entirely different from the deceptive, intoxicating quiet of the morning before the attack. That previous silence had been an illusion, a beautiful lie that the forest had told them to ease their weary minds. It had been filled with the terrifying, invisible tension of a held breath. But this silence, the silence that follows the fire, the ash, and the terrifying shadows in the mist, was fiercely, undeniably real. It was a heavy, exhausted quiet. It was the sound of a world that had exhausted its capacity for violence and had simply collapsed into slumber. It was a silence earned through endurance, paid for with terror, and held together by the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human heart. Elias lay on his back, his eyes open, tracing the delicate, overlapping silhouettes of the pine branches against the starlit sky. His body was completely numb, the biting cold having settled deeply into the heavy wool of his greatcoat. Yet, beneath the freezing fabric, he felt a strange, profound warmth radiating from the center of his chest. It was the undeniable, miraculous thrum of his own heartbeat. In the chaotic, deafening roar of the morning, when the sky had rained splintered wood and jagged steel, Elias had forgotten the sound of his own life. The noise of the world had been too vast, drowning out the simple, quiet rhythm of his existence. But now, in the deep sanctuary of the ravine, that rhythm was the loudest thing in the world. Thump! 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 It was a slow, steady drumbeat of survival. He moved his stiff, gloved hand, reaching slowly into the deep pocket of his coat. His fingers found the smooth, rounded surface of the river stone. He did not pull it out into the freezing air, he simply held it there in the dark. He thought of the water that had shaped it, flowing endlessly, patiently over the stone for thousands of years, wearing away the rough edges until it was perfectly, beautifully smooth. Elias realized that he, too, was being shaped by the relentless current of the world. The terror, the noise, the blinding ash, they were the rushing waters of history, carving away his innocence, wearing down his youth. But as he held the stone, he found a gentle, quiet comfort in knowing that the core of him remained solid. The river had not washed him away. The storm had not broken him. He was still Elias. He still remembered the smell of his father's bakery, and he still carried the quiet, gentle love for the boys sleeping beside him. Just a few feet away, nestled against the sloping earth of the ravine, Thomas lay awake. The older veteran had not closed his eyes. His broad, heavy arm was draped protectively over the small, shivering form of young Leon, who was finally submerged in a deep, exhausted sleep. Leon's breath came in soft, rhythmic puffs of white mist, his face buried deeply in the rough wool of Thomas's coat, seeking the safety of a surrogate father in the freezing dark. Thomas watched the boy sleep, a deep, melancholic tenderness swelling in his chest. To be a veteran in this place was not about holding a rifle with a steady hand, or knowing how to read the terrain. True, everyday heroism was found in the quiet, agonizing work of shielding the young from the emotional weight of the world. Thomas had absorbed Leon's terror during the bombardment. He had taken the boy's trembling hands and guided him through the blinding smoke. He had carried the fear so that Leon would not have to. Now, in the silence that followed, Thomas felt the immense, crushing weight of that responsibility. The silence allowed his mind to finally wander, and it drifted immediately to his own home. He thought of his own children, sleeping in their warm beds far, far away. He prayed to whatever gentle forces remained in the universe that if his own sons were ever lost in the dark, some quiet, older stranger would reach out a hand and wrap them in a warm coat. He gently pulled the heavy collar of his greatcoat higher around Leon's ears, tucking the boy tighter into the warmth of his side. It was a tiny, invisible act of grace, a moment of profound, protective kindness that the grand history books would never record, but one that contained the entire, beautiful essence of human love. On the other side of the sleeping huddle, Johannes sat with his back resting against a frozen log. He was awake, his eyes fixed on the pale, silvery light of the moon as it began to crest the tops of the highest pines. His hand was, as it had been all day, pressed firmly against his chest. Beneath his freezing fingers, the paper envelope was no longer just a letter. It had become a sacred artifact. When he had written those words by the flickering light of a candle, wrapped in the false, deceptive peace of the winter lull, he had been a man dreaming of a distant future. He had written of apple blossoms and warm rain on cobblestone streets, desperately hoping the war had fallen asleep. But then the sky had torn open. He had carried those words through the trembling dirt, through the blinding ash, and past the terrifying silhouettes in the mist. The letter had survived the end of the world. Johannes realized, with a quiet, breathtaking clarity that the words he had written to Clara were now imbued with a totally different spirit. They were no longer just a hopeful wish, they were a profound testament to survival. When Clara finally opened that envelope, she would not just be reading a letter from her husband. She would be holding a piece of paper that had walked through the fire. She would be touching the exact same paper that had pressed against his racing heart while he lay hidden in the roots of the oak tree. The physical letter was a bridge of love that had refused to burn. He closed his eyes and whispered her name into the freezing, silent air. It was a sound so soft it did not even disturb the frost, but to Johannes, it was louder than the morning's artillery. It was a declaration that he was still here, and that his heart was still firmly anchored to her garden. It is in these deeply silent, reflective hours that the true, unvarnished history of the human spirit is written. The grand, sweeping narratives of the era focus on the roaring noise, the deafening barrage, the advancing lines, the chaotic scramble and the smoke. But the soul of the history lives entirely in the silence that follows. It lives in the fading, fragile diaries written by shivering hands in the dark, and in the quiet, tear-stained letters that were carried through the mud. To unearth these silent moments, to read the faded handwriting and breathe life back into these quiet acts of resilience, requires countless hours of delicate, emotional research. It takes a profound dedication to look past the loud, celebrated battles and search for the boys sitting quietly in the snow. If you find peace in these hidden stories, and if you believe in the gentle preservation of this quiet humanity, I would be deeply honored if you considered leaving a small tip in my Ko-Fi jar. Your support allows me the time and resources to keep gently dusting off these forgotten memories. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for walking into the silence with me, and for keeping their quiet resilience alive in your heart. At the edge of the ravine, Lieutenant Lucas sat alone, a silent guardian watching over his sleeping flock. He had not slept. His young, ash-stained face was turned upward, watching the slow, majestic rotation of the stars across the freezing sky. The silver badge on his collar was cold, but it no longer felt like a suffocating weight. When he had worn it in the shattered trench, it had felt like an anchor dragging him down into an impossible, deadly choice. But now, as he listened to the slow, steady breathing of the 30 boys he had led safely away from the fire, the badge felt like a quiet promise fulfilled. He had chosen love over orders. He had chosen the lives of his friends over the arbitrary lines on a general's map. And as the profound silence of the winter night settled over the deep timber, Lucas felt a beautiful, absolute peace with that choice. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if the shadows would find them again, or if the cold wind would return to bite their weary faces. But he knew that tonight, they were safe. Tonight, the universe had granted them a reprieve. He looked down at the tangled pile of gray coats in the bed of pine needles. They looked so incredibly fragile, just small, exhausted shapes buried in the vast, indifferent architecture of the ancient forest. Yet, Lucas knew that within those fragile shapes burned an incredibly fierce, quiet light. It was the light of Elias holding his stone. It was the light of Johannes pressing the letter to his chest. It was the light of Thomas wrapping his arms around a terrified child. The silence that followed the storm was not empty. It was filled to the brim with this beautiful, unspoken love. It was a silence that held the echoes of their survival, a quiet, sacred space where the human spirit could finally rest, repair, and remember who it was before the world had tried to break it. Lucas leaned his head back against the frozen earth, pulling his collar high over his chin. He let his eyes flutter closed, keeping his ears tuned to the quiet rustle of the woods. The stars shone fiercely in the absolute cold, casting a pale, silver glow over the hidden ravine. The forest breathed in a slow, majestic inhalation of winter air, and the boys breathed with it, resting peacefully in the deeply bruised, beautiful silence that had followed the falling of the sky. To survive a falling sky is a miracle of the body, but to wake up the next morning requires a gentle miracle of the soul. The transition from the deep, velvet night into the pale, fragile hours of the winter dawn is a terribly quiet thing in the ancient forest. If you were to sit on the edge of that hidden ravine as the stars slowly faded, you would notice that the world does not wake up all at once. It stirs slowly, reluctantly, as if the earth itself is tired from the long, freezing hours of the dark. The sky above the dense canopy of pines shifts from a bruised, endless indigo into a soft, melancholic slate gray. There is no warmth in this new light, only a quiet, crystalline clarity that settles over the snowdrifts and the sleeping forms of the boys huddled in the pine needles. In the absolute stillness of the dawn, Elias slowly opened his eyes. He did not move his body. He lay perfectly flat against the frozen earth, listening to the slow, rhythmic sound of his own breathing. For a long, suspended moment, he did not know where he was. The frantic, terrifying noise of the previous morning, the artillery, the falling timber, the shouting in the mist, felt like a fever dream that had belonged to someone else. But as the biting chill of the winter air crept past the collar of his greatcoat, the memory of the world returned to him. He remembered the shattered trench. He remembered the blinding ash. And he remembered the American boy, no older than himself, stumbling through the smoke just a few yards away. Elias reached down with a stiff, gloved hand and touched his side. He had lost his heavy pack somewhere in the frantic scramble through the woods. He no longer carried his entrenching tool, his extra rations, or his heavy wool blankets. Physically, he was lighter than he had been since the day he put on his uniform. Yet, as he lay there in the quiet dawn, he felt an immense, crushing pressure pressing down upon his chest. It was an invisible weight. It was the heavy, unspoken burden of survival. When you walk through a fire that burns the world around you, you do not emerge empty-handed. You carry the ashes with you. Elias realized that the terrified eyes of the American boy in the mist were now permanently etched into his mind. He carried the sound of the falling pines. He carried the desperate, trembling prayers he had whispered into the dirt. These were not things he could take off at the end of the day and set beside his boots. This invisible weight was a part of him now, a heavy, silent ghost that would walk beside him for the rest of his life. He reached into his pocket and closed his frozen fingers around the smooth river stone. Even the stone felt different this morning. It felt heavier, anchored by the gravity of the things they had all endured. He held it tightly, letting the smooth surface ground him, taking a long, slow breath of the clean pine air to steady his heart. Beside him, the older veteran, Thomas, was already awake. Thomas did not look at the sky. His eyes were fixed entirely on the young boy, Leon, who was still fast asleep, tucked safely beneath the heavy fold of Thomas's coat. Thomas felt the cold ache in his shoulder where the boy had rested his head all night, but it was a welcome pain. It was proof that he had kept his promise. He had sheltered the child from the dark. But as Thomas looked down at Leon's face in the pale morning light, a profound, aching sorrow washed over him. The physical ash and dirt had been wiped away from Leon's cheeks yesterday afternoon, but the face looking back at Thomas was no longer the face of a boy. The soft, rounded innocence of youth had been completely burned away in the span of a single day. The lines around Leon's sleeping mouth were tight and drawn. Even in slumber, the boy carried a heavy, guarded tension in his brow. Thomas gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Leon's forehead, his large hand moving with the utmost, heartbreaking tenderness. This was the invisible weight that Thomas carried. It was the devastating knowledge that he could protect this boy from the shrapnel and the cold, but he could not protect him from the world. He could not erase the thunder from the boy's mind. Thomas carried the heavy, sorrowful grief of a father who knows that his child's innocence is gone forever, stolen by a storm they had no power to stop. A few paces away, Johannes sat up slowly, the dry pine needles rustling softly beneath him. He moved with the careful, deliberate stiffness of an old man. He did not reach for his rifle first. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, pressing against the thick wool of his tunic. The envelope was still there. Johannes closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the frozen earth. When he had written that letter to Clara, sitting by the candlelight in the deceptive peace of the winter lull, the words had felt light and full of simple hope. Now, after surviving the end of the world, those exact same words felt incredibly heavy. They were no longer just ink on paper. They were a profound, desperate vow. He carried the invisible weight of his own love. 2. Love someone so deeply while sitting in the freezing mud is a terrifying thing, because it gives you something to lose. Johannes knew that he was not just trying to keep himself alive anymore, he was responsible for the future of the woman waiting for him in the garden. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was burdened by the heavy, beautiful gravity of her love. It was a weight that exhausted him, but it was also the only thing giving him the strength to stand up in the snow. Lieutenant Lucas stood quietly at the edge of the ravine, watching his men slowly return to the waking world. His silver officer's badge caught the first, weak ray of the morning sun. Lucas carried the heaviest, most silent burden of them all. He had made the choice to lead them away from the line. He had saved their lives, but in doing so, he had taken the full, agonizing responsibility for their futures onto his own narrow shoulders. He was their shepherd now, in a forest filled with wolves. "We must move," Lucas whispered softly, his voice a gentle, steady current that flowed over the sleeping men. "The sun is awake. We cannot stay in one place." There were no complaints. There were no groans of protest. The men simply pushed themselves up from the dirt, moving with a quiet, synchronized grace. They brushed the loose pine needles from their gray coats, their breath pluming together in a shared cloud of white mist. They were a family of ghosts, bound tightly together by the invisible chains of the things they had survived. It is so incredibly easy for the world to look away from these heavy, invisible burdens. The grand, sweeping history books prefer the clean lines of maps, the dates of the offensives, and the loud, roaring narratives of victory and defeat. They do not have the space to record the quiet, agonizing weight of a baker's son remembering the terrified eyes of his enemy, or the silent grief of an older man watching a boy lose his youth in the dark. The true, unvarnished history of the human heart is rarely written down. It is carried entirely in the quiet, trembling minds of the boys who walk through the snow. Because I believe so deeply that we must honor the complete, unedited truth of what they carried, I want to invite you to join a very special community. If you are someone who seeks to look past the sanitized versions of the past and witness the raw reality of the era, I have created a space on Patreon dedicated to uncensored history. There, we share free podcasts that delve deeply into these hidden, psychological realities of the front line. You will also find raw, unblurred video sections that show the true face of the conflict, and a tip jar that allows us to continue this delicate, deeply emotional research. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thank you for helping me lift these invisible weights out of the shadows, and for keeping their quiet humanity alive. The boys formed a loose, single-file line behind their lieutenant, preparing to walk out of the hidden ravine and back into the vast, freezing expanse of the deep timber. Thomas gently placed his hand on Leon's shoulder, guiding the boy in front of him. "Just follow the footprints, little one," Thomas murmured softly. "Do not look at the whole forest. Just look at the snow right in front of your boots." They began to walk. The only sound in the magnificent, towering cathedral of the pines was the slow, rhythmic crunch of their boots breaking the crust of the fresh snow. With every step they took, the invisible weight they carried seemed to settle deeper into their bones. The adrenaline of the battle was long gone, replaced by a profound, echoing emptiness. They walked in silence, locked entirely inside the quiet, private rooms of their own minds. Elias watched the swaying branches above, listening to the gentle whisper of the winter wind. He realized that this march was entirely different from the patrols they had walked just a few days ago. Then, they had been soldiers guarding a line. Now, they were simply survivors, carrying the broken pieces of their own souls through the frost. Johannes walked with his head bowed, his hand resting instinctively near his collar, feeling the steady, comforting beat of his own heart against the letter to Clara. He focused entirely on that rhythm. He let the love he felt for her become a gentle, humming song in his mind, a lullaby that drowned out the lingering, terrifying echoes of the artillery. He carried his love like a lantern in the dark, letting it guide his exhausted feet through the deep drifts. As they walked, a profound, tragic beauty began to reveal itself in their shared silence. They were all carrying their own, incredibly heavy ghosts. They were all suffering under the crushing weight of the memories they could never unsee. But as Elias looked ahead at Johannes, and back at Thomas and Leon, he realized something that brought a sudden, warm sting of tears to his eyes. They were carrying the weight together. Every time Thomas steadied Leon's shoulder, every time Johannes looked back to make sure Elias was still following, they were quietly reaching out and helping to lift the burden from each other's souls. They did not have to speak of the terror to understand it. The shared exhaustion in their eyes, the synchronized rhythm of their breathing, the gentle, unspoken kindness of their movements, it was all a silent testament to their unbreakable brotherhood. The invisible weight of the war was too massive for any single boy to carry alone. It would have crushed Elias. It would have broken Johannes. But distributed across the shoulders of the men who loved each other, the weight became bearable. It became a solemn, shared gravity that anchored them firmly to the earth and to one another. The pale winter sun climbed slowly higher into the gray sky, casting long, deeply blue shadows through the timber. The forest was endlessly vast, indifferent to the tiny, struggling figures moving through its depths. But within that freezing, magnificent wilderness, the boys walked on. They did not march with the crisp, proud step of conquerors. They walked with the slow, shuffling, beautiful resilience of ordinary humans who have looked into the abyss and refused to let go of each other's hands. They carried their letters, their stones, and their quiet, broken memories forward through the snow, bearing the invisible, heavy weight of the world not as a curse, but as a deeply profound, silent testament to the enduring, unbreakable power of love in the dark. Even when the snow finally covers the scars of the earth, the heart remembers the shape of the fire. If you were to follow the fragile trail of footprints leading deep into the ancient timber, you would find a silence that feels entirely different from where we began. The forest here is untouched. It is a vast, towering cathedral of old-growth pine and silent, sleeping oaks, their heavy branches drooping under the incredible weight of the winter snow. The pale light of the afternoon has finally surrendered, bleeding away into the deep, indigo hues of the approaching night. The air is so sharp, so purely cold, that every breath feels like drinking from a frozen mountain stream. Through this endless, majestic wilderness, the small line of gray coats continues to walk. They move with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a quiet cadence of survival. Crunch, step. Crunch, step. It is a mesmerizing, repetitive lullaby. They are no longer soldiers marching toward a destiny drawn on a map. They are just a handful of boys, profoundly weary, navigating the deep waters of a world they barely understand. Lieutenant Lucas walks at the front, his silver badge hidden now beneath the heavy collar of his greatcoat. He does not know exactly where they are going, only that they are moving away from the smoke, away from the terrifying thunder of the morning. And for now, that is enough. He looks up at the canopy, watching the first brilliant stars prick through the deepening twilight. The forest is indifferent to them. It does not judge the color of their uniforms or the language they speak. It simply offers them the shelter of its shadows. Lucas feels a deep, abiding gratitude for that indifference. Here, they are allowed to just be human. Behind him walks Johannes. The gentle woodworker moves with his head bowed, his eyes focused on the hypnotic movement of Lucas's boots breaking the snow. His hand is tucked safely inside his coat, resting softly against his chest. The letter to Clara is still there. As he walks, Johannes imagines the words lifting off the paper, traveling through the freezing air, crossing the miles of ruined Europe, and landing softly on the windowsill of his home. He imagines Clara finding them there in the morning, a quiet reassurance that he is still breathing. The love he holds for her is no longer just an emotion, it is the very fuel that keeps his heavy legs moving. It is a quiet, invisible fire burning in the deepest part of his freezing body. Further down the line, Thomas keeps his steady, protective pace right beside young Leon. The veteran's face is a map of exhaustion, his deep eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken sorrows. But his hand never strays far from the boy's shoulder. Every time Leon stumbles on a hidden route or slows his pace, Thomas is there, a gentle, guiding force in the gloom. Leon is quiet now. The frantic, paralyzing terror that had gripped him in the dirt dugout has finally burned itself out, leaving a hollow, echoing stillness in its wake. But as he walks beside Thomas, feeling the warmth of the older man's presence, that hollow space begins to fill with something new. It is not courage, exactly. It is a quiet, stubborn resilience. Leon realizes that he has walked through the fire and emerged on the other side. He is still freezing, he is still hungry, and he is profoundly tired, but he is alive. And as long as Thomas is walking beside him, the dark forest does not feel quite so vast, or quite so lonely. Elias brings up the rear of their small procession. He stops for a moment, leaning his shoulder against the rough bark of a giant pine, and looks back the way they came. The trail of their footprints winds back into the blue shadows, disappearing into the mist. Somewhere, far beyond those trees, the war is still raging. The great steel machines are still turning the earth, and other boys in different uniforms are still staring into the dark, waiting for the sky to fall. He reaches into his pocket and rubs his thumb over the smooth, familiar curve of the river stone. It is a small, heavy piece of the world that makes sense. It reminds him of the river behind his father's bakery, the smell of fresh yeast, the warmth of the great stone ovens. Elias realizes that the deceptive frost of the winter lull had tricked them into believing the war was over, but it had also given them something incredibly precious. It had given them those few quiet hours in the dugout to remember who they were. It had allowed them to write letters, to share a piece of chocolate, to listen to a bird sing in the canopy. The artillery had tried to shatter those memories, but it had failed. The boys were carrying those fragile, beautiful pieces of their humanity safely away into the dark. It is a deeply moving realization that the most profound victories in history are often not won with weapons, but with the quiet, stubborn preservation of the human soul. The grand narratives of the era focus on the sweeping movements of armies and the roaring of cannons, but so much of what truly shaped the world happened in the unseen margins. It happened in the quiet decisions of men like Lucas, the hidden sanctuaries of the mind, and the secret, invisible operations that turned the tide of the war while the world was looking the other way. If you are drawn to the hidden layers of the past, the quiet secrets and the unseen hands that moved the world while the guns were firing, I have something very special I would love to share with you. I write a weekly email newsletter where we take deep, relaxing dives into these forgotten, shadowy corners of history. It is a quiet community where we explore the unvarnished truth of the era. When you join, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a gentle journey into the invisible heroism, the secret espionage, and the profound, hidden forces that altered the course of everything. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is my gift to you, to help you safely explore the hidden, fascinating depths of the past. The small line of men continues their slow, exhausted march until the forest grows so incredibly dark that they can barely see the snow beneath their feet. The canopy above them is a thick, woven blanket of black pine needles, pierced only by the brilliant, freezing light of the winter stars. Lucas finally halts. They have reached a small, sheltered depression at the base of a rocky outcrop, protected from the wind and completely hidden from the world. "We rest here," he whispers, his voice barely a breath against the cold. There is no energy left for words. The boys simply collapse together, a tangle of heavy wool and exhausted limbs, pooling their meager body heat against the freezing night. They cannot build a fire. To strike a match would be to invite the war back into their sanctuary. But as they curl together in the deep, soft powder, they realize they do not need a fire of wood and kindling. They have each other. Thomas wraps his greatcoat around Leon once more, pulling the boy tight against his chest. The veteran closes his eyes, letting the slow, rhythmic breathing of the child lull his own racing heart into a state of quiet peace. He has kept his promise. The boy is safe for one more night. Johannes lies on his side, his hand resting gently against his tunic. In the dark, he traces the outline of the envelope one last time before his exhausted mind finally begins to drift. He dreams of Clara's garden, not covered in snow and ash, but blooming with the delicate, fragrant white flowers of the apple trees in spring. The dream is so incredibly vivid, so warm and full of light, that a soft, beautiful smile touches his lips as he sleeps. Elias lies on his back, looking up through the dark branches at the glittering tapestry of the stars. He holds his river stone tightly in his hand, feeling the solid, grounding weight of it against his skin. The silence of the forest is profound, but it is no longer the terrifying, expectant silence that precedes an attack. It is the deep, healing silence of a world at rest. The echoes of the morning's terror are still out there, rolling endlessly beyond the trees. The war will still be waiting for them when the sun rises. But for tonight, in this quiet, hidden pocket of the earth, the storm has passed. They are just a handful of boys, freezing and tired, holding onto the fragile, beautiful remnants of their own humanity. They have survived the deceptive frost. They have endured the shattering of their illusions, the falling of the sky, and the terrifying shadows in the mist. They have carried the invisible weight of the world, and they have carried each other. As the deep winter night settles completely over the ancient forest, the boys simply breathe in unison. The cold air fills their lungs, the stars keep their silent watch, and the echoes of the world fade away into the beautiful, absolute peace of the dark. They are anchored to the earth, anchored to their memories, and safely, profoundly anchored to one another. Sleep takes them gently, a soft and merciful blanket falling over the weary, unbroken resilience of the human heart.